Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith, part of the Voice of Neuro. I am joined by none other than Agent Smith himself. Welcome, dude.
Hello.
So we do the hey, how are you kind of thing, and it is what it is. This year's a hot mess, so.
Yeah, there's quite a bit to get through, and I don't even know where to begin with it.
Well, if you want, I can kind of start with a rundown of some of the things that have happened in the past few weeks on the internet side of things with Twitch and what have you.
Go right ahead.
So basically, Twitch as a platform is in an interesting spot right now. Mixer shut down, and Mixer bought some of the top streamers on Twitch, gave them a ridiculously good salary deal to go to that platform and stream there exclusively, and realized that they weren't gaining enough ground on Mixer to compete with Twitch, YouTube gaming, and Facebook gaming. So they closed their doors and released those people from their contracts. They did pay them out, which means they got millions of dollars, and they had, I think, millions more left behind that they were going to get over time, but now they get it all at once. And they're free to stream on Twitch again. So that was a big score for them, and also it more so narrows the playing field. There's one fewer player in the game now. So that's a thing. With Twitch, there are some questions about the way that the channel has been run versus the promises that are kind of made. Many people have been taking issue with the CEO in particular for working really hard on the optics of Twitch, but not as much on the action of how the platform is pushing through changes and enforcing certain things. Like, one thing that we talk about in World Discussion a whole bunch is the difference in, say, a leader stating that they're going to do something, and the difference between that and actually mustering troops or like doing the thing that they're talking about. Like, we've heard the build a wall meme a million times. There hasn't been a major construction project to that end that is how the listeners and things would have envisioned it. So more or less it was just talk and not action. And there's been a lot of that similar stuff with Twitch, of just the difference between how it presents itself and its stance versus how the business side is actually carried out. Twitch is very much a progressive platform. Like, they try to be more inclusive, more diverse than their competitors by a pretty big margin. But there's a pretty big difference between making major changes that enable and allow that to happen versus just making nice PR posts that talk about it. So that's a point of contention and drama. In addition, there was the Me Too outpouring for Twitter, Twitch, a lot of online personalities in general. Some people were asking me earlier, well, why does this happen like this, where it just seems to happen all of a sudden? Basically, with the process of being a victim of abuse, it's scary, and a lot of times you're afraid that people aren't going to believe you if you're a victim of that. So there is a strength in numbers advantage of a lot of people sharing their stories all at once. It shows them that they're not alone in this, and that this does happen more often than people might expect. So that, I think there's a strategic edge for people to choose to do that all at once. It gives them some courage if they see their friends going through similar trials that they went through, and maybe no one has known about it to this point. Then that can be a way for them to get more control in their lives. And one of the main things that I've noticed, and we've talked about with regards to 2020 as a year, is that it is so majorly fucked up that basically the water is hot for everybody. Like, we are at a boiling point where a lot of our issues that we've had kind of in the background, like either swept under the rug or just kind of on the back burner, that we're gonna maybe focus on dealing with these later. Now, I mean, everyone is super pissed off, so we're just seeing what those issues are and just trying to tackle and change something, because we couldn't exactly blame the coronavirus on someone. So there's that feeling of we're not satisfied with how things are. We want change to happen. And these are some of the changes that affect me personally. So I think it's a good thing that people are finding the courage to reach out about this stuff. Doesn't really matter when it is, IMO. If it's something that matters to you and this is an opportunity, then go for it, share your story. And in addition, with Twitch, Dr. Disrespect has been banned. That's one of the unsolved mysteries. Cue the X-Files theme. Why was he banned? No one knows. He gave a very, my lawyer told me to say this tweet, which doesn't really tell us anything other than that he has a lawyer.
Yeah.
I did read there are some cases where he may have been banned and he's not allowed to say why. There are certain criteria where Twitch recommends you don't say, or I think that they're not always legally obligated to tell you why. So it's possible that he doesn't know and they're not going to tell him.
Interesting.
And I have no clues as to what it might be. He's gotten temporary bans for stuff in the past, but I don't know what this specific situation is about. We'll probably find out eventually, though. A lot of people are just spamming the refresh on the Twitch drama subreddit.
No shortage lately, sounds like.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, overall, is Twitch still doing okay? I mean, how is this affecting their bottom line?
Probably not too much. They have a pretty secure monopoly. I think the next biggest player in the streaming scene and stuff is Facebook gaming, and it's not even close. And it would be really difficult, I think, for Facebook gaming to pass up Twitch, mainly because of the nature of the platform. It's kind of awkward to have people's real names and stuff like that thanking you for subscriptions and whatnot. It's not the same type of social platform as Twitch is. And Twitch has Amazon behind it, so it's kind of like, I feel like they'll take it at an easy pace where as long as they feel like they can still be number one, they'll kind of chill at that level. And then if they have a competitor that's really testing them, then they can throw a lot more money and resources behind the problem. That would be my guess.
And has it been affecting you at all?
No, me personally, not really.
So you're fine.
Yeah. Most people who chill and like to watch my stream and stuff, I think the vast majority are Twitch viewers only. Like they don't also watch Mixer and YouTube stuff too much.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But the town is
So you're just kind of riding it out then, huh?
Uh-huh.
Sorry, you were saying something?
No, like business-wise, fulfillment, things like that, the community has been really awesome to me, so I'm stable and solid. Some of it is watching the villagers shouting amongst each other, but I'm not super upset myself about how things are. There are some major improvements I would like to see with Twitch as a platform. One of the things that is a question that they kind of say is their stance is that they put streamers first, which is a pretty vague statement because it doesn't quite articulate what that means. What does it mean if you're putting us first? Does that mean that above all of their priorities, financially speaking, you're saying we're going to look after the health and the value of our broadcasters first, or what?
Sounds like a PR slogan.
Yes, it does. It's a good PR slogan too. Streamers first. I like the sound of that.
Yeah, that's what it's for. It draws you in. Gives you that false sense of complacency.
Mm-hmm. I think they might put us third. The order I was thinking was money first, PR second, streamers third. Because with the way the platform works, the streamers are the ones who actually create the content. Twitch, the company, promotes certain stuff, puts certain things in the spotlight, but they're not making as much content. They have Twitch Rivals, which is like a event that they host, but they're not like writing as many skits. They're not building communities in that same way.
Yeah. Do they make most of their money from advertising?
I think it's from the subscriptions and stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like the people who subscribe to streamers, and they get a cut of that.
They do get a cut of that.
Yeah.
How big a cut is it? If you can talk about it.
It's default 50%, so they get half of
50?
Yeah.
Oh my god. 50%. That's crazy.
Yep. But
I guess they can get away with it.
Yeah, it was set up because they were the only game in town, basically.
Wow.
And now there are a few other games in town, but they're not big enough to the point where that's gonna knock them out of the game.
Well, I mean, is there as much of a networking effect with Twitch? Because it's not like it's not necessarily what's the word I want? Like with Facebook, if you want to contact somebody, they have to also be on Facebook. And the benefit of it is that you have so many other people there on Facebook. But with something like Twitch, you don't really go on to view everybody there. You're going there to view one particular person or a couple of people. So is it as much of a problem to switch platforms for professional gamers, you think?
Yes, basically you lose all of the concurrent sub connections because a lot of people will subscribe and then it's set to auto renew, and that is the #1 way to have like reliable income where you can take a few days off and you're not out in the cold, basically, because we don't get paid vacation, which is another kind of interesting aspect of this kind of job.
It's a new frontier job. I wouldn't expect there to be a lot of benefits and protections for a newer type of job or new industry or what have you. It's kind of out there on the digital frontier, so to speak. So
yeah, that's very true.
Doesn't surprise me. But yeah, that's I guess that makes sense that it would be mostly auto renew. But that's unfortunate that you can't switch platforms easily. That would there were more competition in that, well, that would facilitate more competition and you could probably get a better rate on the subscriptions.
Yeah, and if you're a partner, I think you also have to sign a deal that says that you won't stream on other platforms.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, how do you get to be a partner?
You have to have neighborhood of 100 average viewers. And then there is a manual review process and stuff. So someone looks at your page and sees if they think you're a good fit. Basically, they're looking to see if you're more or less a good person, I think, because they don't want people being like really negative. They do care about their image a lot.
Whether or not you're a liability.
Yeah, basically.
Gotcha. Well, you should be up for it soon then.
Oh, I am a partner. I've been a partner for like 6 years.
Oh, really?
Now. Yeah.
Oh, cool. I must have missed that. Well, is there anything you wanted to, that caught your eye in the news or anything you wanted to touch on in particular?
So we've missed a couple weeks. Part of that is due to like Father's Day and stuff like that. I think I also was like really tired one of the days. But there has been so much that has happened. Like stuff is happening at such an unprecedented rate. I was trying to explain this to my parents when I was visiting them, in that we've discussed that there are periods of stability and periods of change. And I really like what you had to say in the last episode we had together, in that we have taken for granted a pretty long period of stability that was more or less unprecedented. And this period of chaos that we're experiencing is sort of a return to normalcy in a way. So to be super surprised by it is kind of missing that big picture flow of how the decades
Yeah.
have been going.
Yeah, I mean it's happened before. There was a period during the Victorian era at the end of the 19th century and in the first decade of the 20th century that was very similar in the sense that it was very stable and things felt like they were never going to change, and it was very prosperous and there was a lot of technological innovation, and for a lot of people at that time it kind of felt like they were at the pinnacle, like they'd kind of figured things out and it's only smooth sailing from here. And of course, that was just a few years before World War One and everything that came after that. So a rude awakening for them, and this is our rude awakening, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see if we get our postmodern equivalent of World War One coming up next. Hopefully not, but we'll see. You never know. Yeah, it's gonna be a bumpy ride. I was reading about well, a couple weeks ago, I guess. I was reading about the drone swarm technology that the United States is working on, along with other powers as well, working on their own equivalents. And I think the article I read was suggesting that they could be a new weapon of mass destruction because you could make, you know, a lot of them since they would be relatively cheap. You know, these are relatively small drones, and you could just unleash huge swarms of them and decimate a city. You know, as they could just kill people and blow up vehicles and just do all kinds of damage and make mayhem. It would with a sufficiently large swarm, you could definitely do a lot of damage, and there wouldn't be a whole lot that the target country could do. And you know, that's also something that the United States would be vulnerable to. I mean, I don't know that you could do an anonymous swarm drone or an anonymous drone swarm attack, since the technology required for it would probably be limited to a relatively small number of countries. But you know, hypothetically, if somebody wanted to do a sneak attack, there wouldn't be a whole hell of a lot anybody could do in response. So that you know, there. I mean, that's just an illustration of the kinds of problems that we're going to be facing due to technological innovation. You know, warfare is changing. I think 10 years ago or so, I remember reading an article about theorists, you know, military science guys, who were kind of debating about whether or not there would be a return to great power conflict, not competition, but great power actual conflict around the year 2020. And I don't think that's going to come true. It's not on my radar anyway, but there is a risk that that could be the direction we're trending in. You know, I mean, right now there's a sense that you can't have great power conflict because of MAD, you know, mutually assured destruction from a nuclear exchange. But you know, what happens if somebody develops the technology to shoot down a warhead? Uh, you know, either shoot down the missile when it's ascending or to shoot down the warhead when it's descending in the terminal phase. You know, if somebody could get that kind of technology, then you could reach a point where there is a sufficient confidence that you could defeat uh, a nuclear barrage, that you would not be deterred by the prospect of a nuclear attack, and therefore could engage in a conventional aggression of the old school, as it were. So that could hypothetically happen. I don't know how realistic it is because I'm not sufficiently invested in you know, the technology and the military science literature. But hypothetically, that could happen, and that could very much upend our world, as it were. You know, that would definitely be a return to a more violent period of human history. And I don't think that's something that a lot of people in our generation are really prepared for, because that's not what was supposed to happen. That's not what's supposed to happen. You know, we were supposed to have Star Trek. You know, that's sort of that was the expected trajectory, and instead it could come out very differently. So yeah, this could go any number of ways. It's very much a big question mark where we go from here.
Yeah, we have talked about the decline in violence and how that's related to the increase in quality of life, where as people get more comfortable and happy with their current living situation, the less enthusiastic they are to put their life on the line and go into like active military combat. So that's one of the main forces that we have in our favor if you're looking for a peaceful way forward. But as we've talked about with progress, it's not a straight upward trend. There's some squiggles to the line. And
Yeah.
this period of upheaval is messy right now, and there's a lot of turbulence and anger right now. But that's bringing some issues to the surface that we're basically due to get some more progress in that direction anyway. It's just with the pandemic and everyone being grumpy all at once now, there is a natural catalyst for those changes to be brought to the surface.
Yeah, definitely. But it remains to be seen whether or not those changes will be substantive,
Yes.
or whether they'll be superficial. And of course, there's also the question: if the changes are substantive, are they positive changes? Because there's no guarantee that they will be. There's no golden rule that says revolutionary change or political change in general has to have positive results. You can ask the Russians about that.
Yeah, we did talk with Eche Fatum. We have the philosophy segment, and we focused on the protests versus the police and what the protests are about and the social contract between police and the general public and what the problems are in the US and the history of the US since colonial times to present day and the struggle and the fight against racism that has existed for longer than the United States has even been a country here in the continent.
Sounds like a good episode.
Yeah, it was. It was pretty different from a lot of our other formats because usually we hit one of the classical philosophers and we're working more from what that person innovated and thought about. This one was closer to a current event segment, and as a result, it was more tense and spicy.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he said that he really doesn't like doing current events for that reason, just because people are so actively heated about it. Like, not that many people are heated about Confucius at this point. It's been talked about. There's still a lot of value to learn about what Confucius taught and how it shaped the landscape of ideas moving forward. But when you're talking about this kind of thing, like as soon as the topic came up, if you even say the phrase Black Lives Matter, there are some people who are just instantly whipped into a frenzy in one direction or another.
Oh, yeah.
And it's
Probably doesn't help that he's Swiss.
yeah. Well, I mean, he is really chill about it. Like the Swiss perspective here, and I think for a lot of Europeans, they're like, why is the violence of the police so bad in the US? I don't understand.
Yeah.
We've kind of always had a cool image of the tough sheriff who is a really good lawman because he's really fast with his gun. Like that's been a meme for a long time in the US, and it's something that we respect about our police officers is their ability to deal with those violent situations, but we don't have the same really heavy emphasis that Europe does on having police officers be about making the peace in a situation and de-escalating conflict and having a gentler hand.
Yeah, it's just not the way the institution evolved. Yeah. Well, I guess you guys probably went over all of that. But yeah, it's just policing as an institution in the United States is very evolved very differently than in Europe, to put it mildly. And just Americans themselves are a colorful bunch.
Yeah.
We have our very own particular preferences about how things like fighting crime and whatnot should be done.
So yeah, that was a good conversation, and there's I guess with this current wave, some states are turning things around. I did see Texas. They tried to open up earlier, and there were a whole bunch of new cases, so they're walking that back a little bit. You're in Texas. What is the inside scoop on that?
Oh, God, nobody gives a shit anymore. I mean, I have friends, out on all sides of the political spectrum, and the friends on the left are just livid
Mm-hmm.
because they don't feel like people are really taking it sufficiently seriously. There's people not wearing masks and going out in crowded places. But Texas is a pretty conservative state, so they're relatively in the minority. And the impression I get is that people are just moving towards starting things up again in general. That you can see people just going out and kind of doing their normal thing almost, as though nothing is really going on. So it seems that the implicit decision on the part of the broader public is to just resume normal activity as much as possible, and whatever the consequences are, then those are just the cost of doing business, so to speak. So, whatever people think of that, whether they like it or not, that's just kind of where we're trending. The Texas government is trying to, like you say, it kind of has tried to draw down the opening. It's kind of reimposed some restrictions, but I think they're kind of swimming upstream on that. I don't think it's really going to work. There's just a trend towards people getting back to normal, and I don't think the state government is going to be able to do much about that, even if they do impose more restrictions. So Texas seems to be going full herd immunity
Mm-hmm.
as far as how it's going to resolve the crisis, and that's going to be interesting because I know there are some other states that are taking it much more seriously. And I think I read somewhere a headline. I don't think I got to the article yet, but I did read the headline that some states were restricting travel from certain other states. I know that Rhode Island did that for New York, I think, a month or so ago, but it seems that maybe some other states are implementing similar restrictions since the virus caseload is increasing so rapidly in certain other states. So there could be some tension there, but in general, I don't think there's much anybody can really do to stop Texas from dealing with it in its own Texas way, and that's something that a number of other conservative states are also doing, and also Florida. Florida, I don't know that you can call Florida a conservative state. It definitely has conservatives, but it's generally 50-50, at least in the presidential vote. So it's dysfunctional, suffice to say. So Florida, Texas, and a range of other states, they're all handling it in a similar fashion. Kind of doing it in the way Sweden's doing it, only without the competence. And actually, even Sweden is kind of hurting now. They couldn't really. They tried to just. Are you familiar with how Sweden handled things?
Yeah, they more or less said we trust our people to not be obnoxious about it, so just like don't
Yeah,
fuck around, use common sense.
yeah.
And they
So
didn't
that's
have official lockdowns and stuff. It was more like honor system.
exactly. So that worked for a while, but now the numbers are still increasing where they've been falling in other European states. So, and it's also spreading into the what's the polite term for them? The
Old folks' homes.
that's what I was trying not to say, but
Oh,
yeah, yeah.
retirement homes.
There we go. That's the one. Yeah, that's been hitting retirement homes pretty hard in Sweden. So there's been some angsting over that. I don't think the Swedish government is really thinking about changing direction, but there has been more debate about it. And I think there was a sort of de facto truce between the major political factions in Sweden that was broken because there was so much tension over that. They had de facto agreed to just not criticize each other, not attack each other for the duration of the crisis, but there's sufficient tension over whether or not the government is doing the right thing here that isn't happening anymore. At least that's what I read. So that's Sweden also kind of having the same experience that Texas and other such places are having. So that's what it's like down here.
Hmm. Sounds like a party.
Well, for a lot of people, it literally is. Yeah, I expect it's just going to kind of run its course over the course of the remainder of the year. And I'm starting to wonder whether it'll even matter if there's a vaccine. If people are just willing to take the risk and kind of internalize it without even really worrying about it, then normal activity can just kind of resume, and it may not even really have a big economic impact by the end of the year if things kind of continue as they are, at least in Texas and in similar states. That remains to be seen. But I guess if you're interested in economic recovery after all the damage COVID has done, that's at least a positive sign. I actually posted an article on Twitter today that was kind of arguing that point, just noting that a lot of people around the world are just kind of accepting the risk and going out, or are ignorant of the risk, depending on your perspective. And whatever the implications are for the health and well-being of the population, economically speaking, that's a positive sign, since that suggests that there's going to be a resumption of normal economic activity and a return to standard normal demand patterns sooner rather than later. And also, the U.S. had unusually, well, not unusually, the unemployment numbers fell unexpectedly, I think, in the last month. So that was considered a positive sign. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a trend towards economic recovery, but at the very least, things aren't getting worse, which is definitely a positive development. So those are some positive signs economically speaking. So hopefully, we're not going to get the new Great Depression, the L-shaped recovery some people were worried about. That recent evidence suggests that's less likely.
Mm-hmm.
So some good news in that sense. So what about you? How are things up in Washington?
Well, this is one of the more heated parts. We have our region that is, I think, supposed to be autonomous, like not policed and stuff, which
I was going to ask you about that. Chaz. You got to tell me about Chaz Nero.
well, basically, Seattle, if you think about it in the basic sense, is kind of a hippie's paradise in general. It's very nature loving, free, happy, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is sort of like that to the nth degree, in a sense. I haven't been out there and I haven't done a ton of research on it, but when someone told me that that was the case, it was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's a way to extend the protest beyond just stating that you're upset to actively trying to demonstrate that, like, we don't need the police, that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And that's a project that has been done over and over and over again. If you think about pilgrims, people who leave a place and they say, man, this place is so corrupt and messed up, we're going to go start fresh where there are no people. Going to, like, Iceland, for example. And it turns out that people have some aspects within themselves where if they have an opportunity to grab power and to command power over other people, they will abuse said power in a negative way. So it's kind of like people are the problem, not specifically the concept of having police.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I was describing to some people was the difference between the beginning stages of a Civ game and when you get to the mid game, and the difference is bandits. In the early game, you have to establish some level of security so you're not under bandit rule. Because if you don't have an institution that has the monopoly on violence, meaning that they are the arm of the law and they can enforce justice and do stuff in a way that the people have agreed that they understand what our better interests are and they can fight to protect those. If you don't have that, then it's basically the dude who walks around who has the biggest axe and the biggest goons who gets to take whatever they want from you and tax you and charge you tolls if you go over their bridges and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So this has been a really difficult thing too, which plays into the polarization of our politics as a whole, which is it's hard to find a compromise. What is the compromise where we can push through an effective change? Because if half the side is screaming their heads off and the other half of the side is also doing that, and they both have a really extreme solution to the problem, then they're not going to make any ground in any direction. So is it possible for the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands to make some agreed upon adjustments to how police work is done, how police officers are trained and supported, and how different municipalities fund all these different things. Because I've talked with conservatives and talked with progressives about this, and a lot of people who are conservative think that the progressives are trying to eliminate police as a concept and go to anarchy rule. Like, that's honestly their perception of the situation, which is not what they're looking for a lot of them. Some of them are, actually, which makes it even more confusing. Some of the people who are out on the front lines do actually argue for a state of anarchy and that kind of thing, which is, it's silly if you think about how much we've built up and how effectively a lot of these institutions have served us over time. So yeah, heck, what is our middle ground? How do we move forward?
Well, that's the historical billion-dollar question, and it's all the harder to resolve that in an era like this, where everything is hyper-partisan and exaggerated and turned into a struggle of good versus evil. It's not the best framing for a debate like this, where you're going to try to change an important institution. And there's been some decent proposals. I don't know how much you and Etchi Fatum talked about defund the police and what that means exactly.
We did a little bit. The term itself is kind of tricky because it makes it sound like you're taking all the money away from the police when it means less money for the police.
Yeah, it's actually not that radical a proposal. It's actually just more of a different framing for the same political debate that a lot of localities have been having for ever. The idea is that you increase funding to other institutions in the city government that are designed, or that could be designed, to handle certain situations that the police have been handling but are not really in their wheelhouse to handle. That is to say, that the police handle a lot of things that are not really the work of a policeman. The analogy here in Dallas after the police shootings, well, not the police shooting, but the shootings of the police, actually, a couple of years ago, was that the police were de facto dog catchers. If a dog gets loose, it's actually the police that have to go and get it, because there's no city dog catchers, or the animal control has limited resources, etc. So if you want to increase resources to, say, animal control, such that they can handle that, and that the police, so that the police don't have to, I think that's good for everybody. The police would want that. The public wants that. That's a positive win-win for everybody. And it's not just dogs. It's any number of things. I think the example that keeps being brought up is people having mental health crises. Such people need mental health professionals, and police are not that. They can be trained in that, but it's not their area of expertise. So if you could have an institution that could send people out to handle those situations, that also is a win-win, because police themselves do not want to be in situations where, just in general, they don't have the training to handle them. They have a relatively narrow set of things that they're well trained in and are experts in, and that's really what they would like to focus on. So if we could alleviate the burden on them by having these sort of extraneous areas of responsibility be handled by institutions actually trained to deal with them, that's a positive win for society in general. So that really is what defund the police means. But of course, the trouble there is that just gets wrapped up in the political debate about taxes and what programs need spending and etc. The whole political rigmarole in the United States, because it's not as though we got here out of nowhere. It's not as though the present situation is just a random happenstance. The reasons that we don't have those institutions, that is to say, alternative institutions to the police that are as well funded as they need to be. The reason is because people debated about, there needed to be tax cuts at various times due to revenue shortfalls, and those institutions got cut. And there were debates about how much resources the police should get vis-a-vis those other institutions, and a lot of times people wanted the police to get them. And that doesn't even get into the influence of the police union and other political actors in society. So there's been a political competition, well, political debate, let's say, about how to spend city budget money, and town budget money and county budget money all over the United States, for generations, for decades, and the present circumstance is the outcome of that. And reframing that debate about how to best allocate resources, that's potentially useful. You can take advantage of the outrage over the George Floyd killing and the general tension about the suffering and disadvantages faced by Black people, among other peoples in the United States, and use that to try to leverage the political factions and perspectives that want to push for positive reform, such that you could get those alternative institutions. But ultimately, I think what's going to happen is that we're going to come back around to the original debate, which is how much should we raise taxes? How do we allocate those resources to given institutions, etc., such that we may well just end up in the same place that we started with after all. And in that sense, that obviously that would be very disappointing. But I think that's something to keep in mind. It's not as though this is inevitably going to end in a major reform effort. That would be ideal. I think there does need to be positive change in that sense, but again, you have to deal with those institutional blocks and barriers, and also the voters. It's not as though the police are a totally unaccountable institution. That's not to say they're sufficiently accountable. There does need to be more accountability, but fundamentally, they're not really going to be able to do anything that the city doesn't let them do or tell them to do. And the city itself can't tell them to do anything unless they have political support from the voters, or at least if city leaders think that they have political support of the voters, because of course they want to get reelected. So I think really the underlying problem that I think has gone somewhat unobserved is that one of the big issues that's blocked reform is voters. Voters themselves have often opposed and blocked the changes that have been proposed over time. And so that unless that changes, you're not really going to get the kinds of significant reforms that activists and other supporters of change are kind of hoping for. And that really is kind of the point of this this meandering answer I'm trying to kind of flesh out here. It's that you can try to change the police, you can try to change the city, you can do all of that, but if you can't get the votes, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to matter. And that really, I think, needs to be observed more. One of the big problems in U.S. politics, as we've kind of been, hinting at and touching on here, is that voters of different perspectives in the United States are not very good at reconciling their differences at this point. In a sense, you could even go so far as to say that the U.S.'s entire political culture, if not its economic geography in general, is designed in a way such that people can avoid having to negotiate with people with different political opinions. That goes back to white flight way back after World War II. Before World War II, cities were, I guess, what people outside the United States would consider normal cities, right? You have the core where the economic activity happens, and that's where most of the people live, and then poorer folks live further and further away from the city center, the poorer they are. But what happened after World War II, if not during World War II, is that there was more and more, well, for one, African Americans migrated up, so there was more and more diversity in the cities. But also the cities themselves were getting bigger, more crowded. They were getting more dangerous in a sense. There was more crime. There was more environmental issues, And after World War II, there was this massive economic boom, and a lot of people had support from the government in the form of New Deal programs of one sort or another. And so there was kind of an impetus on the parts of a lot of people to just get the hell out of the city. Why should we deal with all of these problems when I have the money to go and move out to the suburbs? And that's really where the suburbs kind of exploded. And there were suburbs before this in the United States, but suburbs really got to be huge during this period after World War II. And a big driver of that was just there were different drivers of that happening, but one of them is that if I live in a suburb, I'm going to live with a lot of people who are like me and are not going to disagree with me, so I don't have to have these difficult debates about what kinds of political trade-offs I'm willing to make. If I'm just with a bunch of like-minded people in a suburban community outside of the city, no trade-offs necessary. We all agree about what the local city laws are and what the rules should be, and so there's just no need for that. And that's kind of colored a lot of American politics since the 1950s. There is this sort of implicit preference for dealing with problems by just trying to rearrange the demography and geography of the country such that you don't have to deal with them. It's people moving. Now we have exurbs. It's not even just suburbs anymore. We have these exurban areas where people are living even farther, away from the cities. So there's just this kind of atomization of society happening that's been happening for a long time. And on the one hand, it's been useful in the sense that it has helped to alleviate some of the tension. That was kind of the point there for those people leaving in the first place. But it's also had the negative side effect of leaving a lot of problems unresolved. Some of the underlying drivers of driving tension of one sort or another with one issue or another. None of that ever really gets addressed because people just don't have to address it. They've just set up the local political structure such that nobody has to directly deal with it. And so that's kind of poisoned American political culture over the decades, since now successive generations of people have grown up without having to really face significant difficulty in terms of political differences. Sort of this de facto segregation and homogenization of local communities. The result is just very poor negotiators. And without that, it's kind of hard for broader society to deal with issues, because it's all good and well if you want to live in a homogenous community and do things your own way, but eventually you are going to have to vote in state elections, national elections. And so what happens at that point? We know the answer. We've seen, the Contract for America back in the day, in the mid '90s. We saw the Tea Party, after Obama won election. We've seen. I'm sure there's leftist equivalents, but the left hasn't really had quite the equivalent of the Tea Party or Contract for America, at least not yet. Maybe we'll see that soon. But these sorts of political movements elect people who are relatively radical, and both left and right will do that, and you end up with populists in Congress whom are not really elected to negotiate. They're elected to grandstand. And they do, and nothing changes. It's a big part of why we have so much deadlock in American political culture. And, I know I'm kind of being reductive and simplifying things, but I'm just kind of trying to drive home that point that voters themselves and the differences between them and the inability of American voters to settle their differences in a, I don't want to say civilized per se, but in an effective way, is a big reason why we have the problems we have, up to and including the problem with race and policing. And until that gets more attention, I'm not really confident that there's going to be a significant reform effort in that vein. I could be wrong. We'll see. Maybe people do have the votes after all, but I suspect that it's still going to be a running problem anyway, because you're still going to have that undercurrent of people who oppose it. And that I don't think that ends well, but we'll see. That's just my thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, it's definitely a life skill that I think isn't really honed and worked on enough, which is communicating to people who don't share your same perspective. That's really hard to do.
Yeah.
Because you have to figure out first what their perspective is, and then how it's different from yours, and then you have to think about a communication strategy for articulating your position to them, and then also figuring out how you could find some common ground with them and then push something through that you both agree is to the benefit of both.
Yeah, that's a skill. That's a skill that you have to hone with time. And just my concern is that that's not a skill that is being honed.
But confirmation bias feels so good, dude.
It does. It does, and it makes life easy. But we're going to have to get over that because, just the world is getting smaller. That's been the impact of the technological changes and the structural economic changes that I like to talk about so much. That's the world is getting smaller, and it's only going to get harder for people to segregate themselves like they used to. I mean, we've seen that with I don't know what to call it really. I mean, the propensity of people who offend certain political perspectives to have people on the internet go after them and get them fired. That's always been a tool. There's always been businesses that feel like they have to fire people because those people have done something to offend the community. But that particular form of pressure has never been more powerful than it has been now. Because it used to be, it was pretty hard to do that outside of your own community. It's not, there just wasn't enough information. You had your local newspaper and word of mouth, and that was about it. So you didn't really hear about people in other places doing stuff like, just doing stuff that was flagrantly offensive. So it was hard to bring to bear public pressure against every instance of that. But now we have so much technology and information that you kind of can. It's a lot easier to do that now. And it's a lot easier to get, just, millions of people. You can get the whole nation riled up because information just spreads so fast. And that's new. That's new. And just the fact that that even exists at all just illustrates my point that it's going to get harder to just avoid problems. And the longer you do, the more tension you're going to have. Because unless there is some kind of mutual understanding about what constitutes acceptable behavior, there's just going to be more people, who feel like they're not doing anything that deserves to get fired, getting fired. And that just feeds into that tension. But if nobody wants to negotiate, if nobody wants to attempt to reach any kind of reconciliation, then that's just going to keep happening. It's just going to keep generating more friction. It's going to be like a brake without brake pads, and it's only going to get hotter, and eventually you're not going to have any brakes.
Yeah. A key thing I think for people to work on that is a consistent flaw is whenever someone articulates an issue, say, for example, someone says racism is a major problem in the United States of America. People of color, Black Americans, Hispanic, Latino Americans, they're discriminated against and it's unfair.
Yeah.
And some people will hear that and they may be, say, white, for example, and they hear that statement, but what their brain tells them is this person is saying that you are a villain who is causing the world to be a terrible place. And then they get into an extremely defensive state of mind where it's like, that's not a narrative that I agree with. I'm not racist to people. I didn't do nothing. And they're kind of speaking and acting as though they were personally just put on trial, rather than someone articulating a longer term systemic issue where a solution requires the participation of the whole group, including the privileged group in this context. Or they'll have some other example of, well, I know a nice police officer, so I don't agree with there being problems with police. A lot of anecdotal stuff and a lot of reactions that involve thinking about the individual person and an us versus them kind of mindset with it. It's really hard to unpack the issue in a way that allows the person to participate and not feel attacked when you're going across these ideological lines, because we've been so heavily trained to think about the opposite side, whether you're left-leaning or right-leaning, as biased and stupid.
Yeah, it's a problem with communication. It's just it's not taught and it's not learned, and there's just a lot of poor communication happening, and it's hard to know what to do about that, because that's just a kind of a social thing. The quality of communication in a society is a function of broader factors in that society. So, if communication does deteriorate to the point where democratic discourse is not really functional, then you can't really snap your fingers and say, okay, well, let's change those factors in society that are causing that. That's kind of baked in. And social trends like that take a long time to kind of filter out. And you can't even really stop them. You can only really ever mitigate them. So if that is kind of the direction we're going in, that's that's a source of big concern, because if that does just continue to get worse, we may not really have any substantive tools to really arrest it. So I kind of hope that's not where we're going. I hope this is kind of just a temporary thing that is a sort of outgrowth of the political tensions and economic changes and sort of these fleeting factors, these transitory factors that are sort of defining the era. And once they kind of go, once we do reach a new sort of equilibrium, once we finish this transition that we're in, then hopefully that'll kind of help return discourse to normal, and we can kind of actually communicate and address some of these problems substantively. I'm not saying we can't solve them substantively now, but it's better to reach a consensus than it is to impose a solution, because those consensus solutions are longer lasting. They're not going to be challenged. If you impose a solution, then the people that feel that they're being imposed on are going to undermine it wherever they can. Mm-hmm. And the larger that group of people opposing who are trying to undermine it, the more dysfunctional the policy in question will be, but also society in general. We've kind of seen this with the Brexit referendum, which we've talked about before. A 51% outcome to a referendum is pretty much the worst possible result.
Yeah.
As we've talked about before. So when it comes to reconciling difficult social problems, it's the same thing. Even if you don't have a referendum, if you can't reach a consensus, it's going to be very difficult for any kind of solution to really truly be effective. Because there's going to be just so many people fighting you who feel that they're being put upon and tread upon. Mm-hmm. So you can make some gains if you impose a positive solution. I'm not going to deny that. I would concede that point, but in the long run, it's probably going to hurt you, I would wager. Lofty problems, Neuro.
Indeed.
So did you want to hear about the Satanist neo-Nazis infiltrating the U.S. military?
What in the earth? Is it a movie?
It's a real thing.
It's a real thing.
That is a real thing.
Wow.
I shit you not. I was reading about it this week, and I just thought, this is not important news, but this is definitely something that we could talk about.
These are memes. Would you like to talk about some memes that I browsed?
Yeah, I actually kind of took some notes on it, and then I kind of recalled reading about some other far-right groups. So I just kind of made a list here of 3 of these far-right groups that I've kind of encountered in the news over the course of the past year or so. And these are sort of newer groups, I think. So that, I guess you could consider these the sort of millennial contribution to the far-right extremists, far-right extremism. So this is us, Neuro.
Oh no.
So to speak. So let's start with the Satanists. That's a pretty bizarre story. And I'm not joking. This is a real thing that happened. I couldn't really believe it, but this apparently is a real group. They call themselves the Order of Nine Angles. And they're a group that started in the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. And what happened was, the story in question was that an American soldier in Afghanistan was arrested because apparently he leaked information about his unit to the Order of Nine Angles, as it were, in the hopes that they would send the information to the Taliban so that the Taliban could ambush his unit. And that may sound bizarre, but that's because you haven't heard what this organization is about. Once you do, that'll make a lot more sense. So it is the organization in question is a neo-Nazi Satanist occult group, which was founded in the UK. And amongst its tenets, I'll just list them here for you. They call for the overthrow of the West's Judeo-Christian order and encourage members to isolate themselves from society, commit crimes, and embrace political extremism.
Wow.
Let's see. New followers must spend at least 6 months in a quote-unquote inside role. And the idea there is to infiltrate and subvert institutions of one sort or another, particularly the police and army. And they also, in terms of their organizational structure, are decentralized. So they have no centralized leadership of any kind. It is very loose and flat in terms of its organizational state. Also, they've expressed an admiration for not only Nazis, including Adolf Hitler, but also Islamic jihadists, such as Osama bin Laden. So it's a very wide-ranging field
It
of
just sounds like
extremism.
they worship the chaos god or something.
Well, that's actually my next point.
Oh man, I knew it!
So their aim, and I was reading about this just today, their aim is to create a new imperial civilization based on a cruel mixture of social Darwinism, Satanism, and fascism. That's a quote from the article.
Wow.
And amongst the things that they've done, members of their group, which used to be on Facebook and is no longer for obvious reasons, their members had been posing at the sites of various, and this is also a quote from the article, posed at the sites of various notorious rapes and murders, celebrating the perpetrators and the process.
Definitely chaos god.
So it probably won't surprise anybody to hear that these people are accelerationists. They're not interested, as other far-right groups have been, in building their support base and trying to appeal to the public and present themselves as functioning, upstanding members of society with the ideas that are misunderstood and that should be looked into. Rather, this is a group that explicitly rejects society as a whole and is looking to just destroy it outright, right down to its very core. And in that sense, this group is actually very similar to a certain other group in the Middle East you've probably heard of, the Islamic State, which also took an extremely violent approach to governing, if you can call it that. Of course, the Islamic State's whole strategy was to just be as violent and confrontational and outrageous as possible, in the hope not only of intimidating opponents, but attracting like-minded people to their group. So the Order of the Nine Angles here seems to be taking a page from that group. And with that in mind, I think that it kind of explains and rationalizes, if you can use that word, why the person in question leaked info to the Taliban. Because it really is, for them, just about doing as much damage as possible, even if it means setting up an ambush of your own unit in an active war zone. So that's the Order of the Nine Angles, which apparently is a real thing.
Wow.
So that's one far-right group.
Sounds like a bad spin-off of a Tarantino movie.
Well, 2020 is the gift that keeps on giving. So here's the newest thing. So the next one is called The Base. And right away, that should ring a bell, because The Base is actually the Arabic name, is the English translation of Al-Qaeda. You've probably heard, I think everybody's heard of Al-Qaeda at this point. Well, the English translation of Al-Qaeda is The Base. So this far-right group is called The Base. And that says a lot. They don't really do as much right now, because they haven't been in the news for violent attacks or etc., but they are organizing. And I think this one has a much stronger, more hierarchical leadership structure than the Order of Nine Angles we just talked about. And what I did read about it is that it's led by a veteran of the U.S. military. And he's an interesting guy. He's he was in the military and he became a contractor. But the interesting thing about him is that he actually left the United States and is now living in St. Petersburg in Russia. And apparently from there, he and some other like-minded folks have been trying to build this organization. And the latest article I read about them is that they're recruiting people online and vetting potential candidates. There was a video recording of an interview that they did online that was leaked to the media, in which they were vetting a potential recruit and just talking about his ideological commitment and some of his background and etc., and whether or not he would be a good addition. So this is a group that isn't doing much, but it's getting ready to do stuff. They are a group that is opposed to the U.S. zeitgeist, as it were, the status quo. It's not entirely clear just what their ambition is, just how much they want to change, but they are preparing some kind of militia movement, as it were. And of course, the question that has to be asked is, if this group is based in St. Petersburg, are they getting any support from the FSB or some other institution within the Russian security apparatus? And that is an interesting question, because obviously the Russian government has some incentive there. It would be a pretty dramatic move on their part, a very bold move to support a potential terrorist group that might be organizing attacks in the United States. So I'm a little skeptical that the Russian government would be willing to go that far. But it could be that there is something happening. There could be some link there from maybe 2 or 3 degrees removed, as it were. Intelligence agencies are notorious for dealing with groups like this at more than an arm's length. So it's not that they don't deal with them, but it's that they make sure that there's a lot of plausible deniability. So that is kind of an open question. I don't think the Russian government would do that, but it is a little weird that the guy ended up in Russia. So that's something else to look forward to over the next couple of years. So the third one is weird, if you can call it that. It's not even really an organization. It's more of just an identity or a movement. And you've probably read about them, Neuro. Have you heard about Boogaloo?
Boogaloo?
Yeah.
Like electric boogaloo?
That's actually what they're named after.
No? What about this? What is this?
So it's actually a far-right militia group that started out on 4chan. And they're libertarians and rabidly anti-government, and they are also accelerationists. They're not about building a movement or anything. They just want to end the government. And they've actually had some people go out to some of these Black Lives Matter protests, and they go there armed with the stated intention of protecting the protesters from the police. But there is also some suspicion that they might also be acting as agents provocateur, instigating confrontations with the police, between the protesters and the police, in the hopes that violence will escalate and perhaps will snowball into some kind of general insurrection that they could participate in and use to achieve their goal of overthrowing the U.S. government. So they don't have a leadership structure per se, but they do have a number of common symbols and ideas that they all operate under. And the interesting thing for me is that is the symbolism in particular. I mean, besides starting on 4chan and everything that implies, they were banned for a time from Facebook. And so what they ended up doing is they used symbols that had names that sounded similar to Boogaloo, like igloo, for example, or a Hawaiian word that I don't quite remember, is something Maui. So as a result, whenever they're out and about or talking online, they try to identify, they make sure to use those symbols so that they can identify each other. So if you ever see pictures of the Black Lives Matter protests and you see people with automatic rifles wearing Hawaiian shirts, that's Boogaloo. Because those guys use that Hawaiian word. Again, I don't quite remember it, but that sounds like Boogaloo. And so Hawaiian symbolism is used. They use Hawaiian symbolism to try to identify each other and their movement, as well as igloos and certain other things. So it's a weird group, like I said. I think anything that starts on 4chan is pretty much by default weird, but I never would have thought that they could have birthed a far-right militia. I'd always kind of associated them with keyboard warriors, but it seems some of them have made the break from the internet into the real world, as it were.
Yeah, there is actually something to the point of symbols being used for things that you didn't know. They added a banana emoji to StarCraft in the war chest thing, which, you know what a banana is, right? It's a fruit. And I used that just after GLHF one time, and someone got all riled up saying that it was a racist symbol. And I was like, it's a banana? Hello? It's fruit and vegetable. It's probably, it might not be an organic banana, but it's a banana. I didn't even know this. And they said that in the context of certain soccer matches that have happened, the banana has been used to some racist effect or context that I had no idea of. Yeah. So I was just in good faith, being someone who puts a banana in his oatmeal for breakfast, using a banana to indicate a banana. But with the way that people use symbols for all kinds of different stuff, who knows what other fruits and vegetables are dangerous.
Yeah, that's going to be a running issue, because there's going to be any number of groups that emerge out of the internet probably. It's one of the great things about the internet is that it can bring people together who previously would have had difficulty finding each other because they had such niche interests. But the downside of that is some of those niche interests are violent. And so I think there was kind of a hope that that wouldn't be too much of a problem. And, we hadn't really seen a whole lot of movements emerge out of the internet. Most of the violent far-right groups and far-left groups as well, I assume. Most of those that have been active over the past couple decades have been pre-existing. They were running around doing things before the internet really was a significant factor. So, after 10, 15 years of the internet being widely used, I mean, I think you could be forgiven for thinking maybe, there's far-right people on the internet, but maybe the internet will not itself birth new far-right movements. Maybe that everybody who's far-right will just join one of the pre-existing ones. But it seems that the internet has come of age to the point where now it is creating its own entities. It is kind of its own culture now, and it is blending into reality. It is contributing something to reality beyond that which was pre-existing. So that kind of is an evolution that is coming about because of the internet. And I suspect these three far-right groups I've described here are some of the fruit of that. Certainly Boogaloo, but also probably the other two.
These are strange times, my friend.
Well, hopefully it doesn't get worse. I mean, because like I said, the base and the Order of the Nine Angle, both of those are, if not explicitly, at least implicitly modeled on the Islamic State. And for those who don't remember, the Islamic State was pretty violent, and I don't think anybody relishes the prospect of having a Western white nationalist equivalent running around. You can ask the Iraqis about it. It's the Islamic State was defeated, but it was not crushed. They are still active. In fact, I think one of my notes is that there's been an escalating Islamic State activity in Iraq again. It's been terrorist attacks, hit and run attacks, and the like. They never really went away. And realistically speaking, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to completely crush a guerrilla movement. And that being the case, it is a little worrisome that we have groups like this emerging in the West. Hopefully it's just a flash in the pan, maybe just a temporary thing. But if it's not, that has very serious implications for security, not only in the United States, but many other countries. That is a very negative development there. For now, most of these groups are not too dangerous. They seem very fringe, suffice to say. But it doesn't take very many people to really cause problems for a broader society. The example I always use is the Iraq War. The United States continues to have the most powerful army in the world. The most powerful military, let's say, in the world. I'm sure some armchair general would want to quibble with that, but let's just say the most powerful military in the world. And when the United States invaded Iraq, it obviously was hamstrung by a virulent insurgency. And despite the fact that the United States at one point had, I think, well over 100,000 troops in Iraq, there was never really a point when it was fully in control of the situation. And so the point there is that the Iraqi insurgency was able to foil the most powerful military in the world at the time, perhaps the most powerful military in history. And they did so despite never having more than, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, they never had more than 30,000 people in the Iraqi insurgency. And that was enough. That was enough to foil the plans of the United States government in Iraq. Obviously, there were other factors involved, but 30,000 people was all it took. And that just illustrates that it does not take a whole lot of people in a society to just defeat civil society, to defeat governance. It's not as though you need millions of people in the street or, hundreds of thousands of people taking on the federal government of the US. It would probably only take a couple thousand to really not bring down the government, but to really destroy the sense of security that kind of undergirds American society. And, at that point, it's going to be very difficult to recover, and it's going to be very difficult to predict how political entities, how political actors will respond to that. Ideally with grace and humility, but we're not exactly known for that here in the U.S. So that's disconcerting. It's something to keep an eye on, definitely. So again, that's not really news per se, but that was definitely an eye-catching set of articles that I read over the past week. Well, was there anything in particular that you wanted to touch on here before I just dive into questions and notes and stuff?
Don't think so. I mean, there's so much of a mess. There's going to be plenty of stuff to talk about. So, fire away, sir.
Okay. Well, I guess I can ask. I've just got so many notes, and I really don't know which ones to even get to. I guess the Twitter. I'll do the Twitter one next. Have you heard about this? The executive order signed by Trump attacking Twitter?
I think so, yes. Vaguely. So a refresher may be good.
So this may not really come to anything, because it may be that the government just doesn't have the authority to do this. But it has the potential to seriously impact social media as an institution and social media companies. So I think everybody is pretty familiar at this point with this debate in society about just what responsibilities social media companies have to control the content on their sites. If it's, I think everybody agrees that they have an obligation to deal with violent content. Anything that instigates or promotes violence, everybody generally thinks that should be removed. But then there's this sort of gray area between violent content and nonviolent content, wherein content can be harassing or can hint at violence or can imply violence or is discriminatory or etc. There's this sort of gray area in between where people of different political preferences have different ideas about what should or should not be allowed in the public sphere, and what in turn social media companies should do about that. So this debate has waxed and waned over time, and one of the points in the debate is centers on Donald Trump, because obviously he is a major figure as the president of the United States, but he's also, I don't think it's controversial to say that he's an inflammatory figure, certainly with how he tweets on Twitter. So that being the case, he's the center of a lot of criticism. Twitter critics of Twitter say that Twitter should do more to control what he posts online. Well, not control per se, but should be more active in removing content that people believe to be offensive and inflammatory, and if not outright calling for violence in the perspective of some people. So Twitter, for its part, has taken the attitude that not only in response to Trump, but in response to the issue as a whole, that they will set certain standards, and that their obligation is to make sure those standards are understood by everybody. Just to be clear, to have clear ground rules and to make those clear to everybody, so that if somebody does break them, then Twitter is in the clear. You can't. It is a private platform. They can run their platform how they want. So long as they just make clear what the rules are, then everything is gravy. Everything should be fine. That's how they've been addressing the problem. But the trouble with Trump is that he actually breaks those rules. So there are these rules in place that Twitter wants everybody to adhere to, but Trump is not adhering to them. So Twitter then is put in a conundrum, because obviously he's a prominent figure, a historical figure, in fact, as much as that may terrify some people. So there is this sense amongst Twitter staff, or at least the owners of Twitter, whoever runs it anyway, that they have an obligation to allow Trump to continue to use the platform, despite the fact that he does on occasion break their rules, break their terms of service. So that's what they've been doing. But recently, in the past month or so, there was a change of tack, and Twitter actually did start to fact check some of Trump's tweets, whatever the right word for that is. And it wasn't anything dramatic. It's not like they were shadow banning or removing anything. They were just adding like a little mark and a little statement that said, this isn't true, this isn't quite, etc. They were just drawing attention to the fact that some of the statements were questionable. So, as you can imagine, Trump took that about as well as you would expect him to.
Not well.
Not well. So he issued, in response, let me check my notes here to make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself. I can. Well, I guess I can give the. I do have the specific example. The fact check clarification that Twitter added just said that the statement in question was "quote unquote" unsubstantiated, and the original tweet that was labeled as unsubstantiated was as follows, and I quote: "There is no way, zero, that mail-in ballots will be anything less than substantially fraudulent," end quote. So that was the statement by Trump, posted on Twitter, that was labeled by Twitter as unsubstantiated. So Trump responded to that, by complaining, as you would expect him to. But the more substantive act he took was to issue an executive order asking the FCC to, quote unquote, clarify the Communications Decency Act. Now, for those of you who are not super familiar with the executive branch of the U.S. and its many, many agencies, the FCC is the Federal Communications, I forget, chat can help me out on that. It slips my mind. But it's responsible for regulating the telecommunications industry in the United States, if memory serves. Maybe that's a good point for the usual disclaimer. I'm obviously not an expert in everything I talk about. So if I say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So, chat and participation by chat is encouraged in that vein. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it after. So I will see it eventually. So that said, the FCC is responsible for regulating the telecommunications industry in the United States. And so they are in turn responsible for regulating social media companies, in so much as they are of the telecommunications industry. So the significance of the Communications Decency Act is that it gives web companies, I guess it's probably not the correct legal term, but companies online, it gives companies online who host content legal immunity from any liability that might be otherwise incurred by the content that they host. So if you have a website and somebody posts something that is explicitly illegal, be it pirated content or something that is in violation of some prostitution, for example, something sexual in nature, things of that variety that are illegal, you cannot be prosecuted for that. Mm. You cannot be held liable for that. There are rules and there are exceptions to the rule, but in general, that is the gist of it. You can't be held liable for that. So that you can host large bodies of content without the unreasonable expectation that you just check all of it, that you have to vet everything that gets posted. Because if you're a very large company with a very large amount of content being posted every day, it's not very realistic to expect you to be able to police all of that. So that's the significance of Trump asking the FCC to clarify the act. I guess I have to elaborate on the act a little more just to get into the meat of it. The act specifies that there are certain firms that qualify as a forum, and it is the forums that qualify for the legal immunity outlined in the act that I just described. But there are a couple of conditions. You can't edit user content, at least to a certain threshold. And it also prohibits the quote-unquote deceptive blocking of content. So you can't remove a post for reasons other than those described in your terms of service. So you have to be clear about that. So that's just to give you an idea of what's in the act here and what the Trump administration is kind of going after, the act itself spells out, wants the FCC to spell out what content blocking would be considered deceptive, pretextual, or inconsistent with the service provider's terms and conditions. So those exceptions to the rule, those preconditions for getting the legal immunity, that's what the Trump administration is asking the FCC to elaborate on. He also asked for I'll just read the quote here, a review of government advertising on social media sites and whether those platforms impose viewpoint-based restrictions. And that's going to be a more debatable one, since you're going to have to get into what's considered not viable. What's considered qualifying curation. If you are allowed to moderate your forum, which is stipulated in the law, you are allowed to moderate your forum and remove content, etc. You can argue that whatever political, censoring, if you can call it that you're doing, if that is what you're doing, you can always just argue that that is just legitimate moderation. So I don't think the federal government is going to have very strong grounds there, and it's probably going to be very hard to push that particular aspect of the executive order. Another thing that they're asking for is the reestablishment of the White House tech bias reporting tool that lets citizens report unfair treatment by social networks. That's probably more of a political move for show than anything. I doubt that's going to really go anywhere, but it will lead to, in so much as that's a positive thing, that would lead to more data anyway. I'm sure there's people who have other avenues to complain at, but the government will get its own source of data on that point. So that's something, but I don't think that'll be a substantive move on the part of the government. I don't think that really means anything. So the only really important part then of the executive order was the first bit, which is that the FCC is going to elaborate on the Communications Decency Act. So the suspicion here is that the government here is implicitly trying to change the definition such that it could take action against Twitter for the alleged infraction taken against the Donald Trump's account. And I think what they're pushing for is to try to have them labeled as a publisher. So social media companies presently labeled as a forum and protected under the Act could hypothetically be relabeled publishers and would lose that immunity. So that's one thing that they're going to look at. But even if they don't do that, they could more specifically look at specific actions by social media companies and define the preconditions necessary for legal immunity in a way that would make it very difficult for social media companies to continue to operate as they have up till now. So to Twitter's, what Twitter has done in response to this is to kind of double down. They're not backing down. They have continued to fact check, so to speak, Donald Trump's personal Twitter account. I think the example that I have here is that the same day the administration announced the executive order, Twitter removed a Trump tweet for quote-unquote promoting violence. And the tweet in question, I have the quote here, "These thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. Just spoke to Governor Tim Walz and told him that the military is with him all the way. Any difficulty, and we will assume control. But when looting starts, the shooting starts. Thank you." So that was the tweet that Twitter removed for quote unquote promoting violence. And again, that was the same day as the executive order. So clearly, Twitter not backing down in this confrontation. Regardless, there's going to be some big implications here. Let me see here. So if they do successfully, the implications are pretty obvious. I think I already kind of outlined that. It's like social media companies will be significantly affected. They'll probably have to significantly either shrink, just so they can get to a size where they could reasonably vet all of the content being posted, or they're going to have to spend significantly more on the legal costs of all the lawsuits that would be coming in, since they would, if these changes go through as the administration wants them to, would leave them significantly more liable to lawsuits of one sort or another, with deleterious impact on the overall digital economy, as one would expect. So Google, for its part, will probably win this. They've already filed a lawsuit and are challenging it in court, and because it's not just Twitter that's being impacted, it's everybody. So Google is already taking them to court, and they'll probably win because the government is, the Trump administration faces the same problem it's always faced with it, which is that, he runs his mouth before he does things. And that means that anybody who opposes the things that he does can just point to when he was running his mouth as an example of how his policy about his attempts to implement policy via executive order or what have you are being motivated are being motivated in a way that is not legal. I'm not a lawyer. You can probably tell. I'm sure I'm butchering this, but the idea is that, for example, if you want to have a ban on immigration from certain areas because you think they're a national security threat, because you think there is a threat to national security posed by continuing to allow free movement of people from those countries to the United States, you can implement a ban on travel from those places. You can implement a travel ban, but you can't do it for another reason. It has to be because you're concerned about national security. It can't be because you want to, say, ban people of a certain religion from coming to the United States. So this, of course, is exactly what happened in the first year of the Trump administration. The administration wanted to ban travel from certain Islamic countries, either because it saw them as a national security threat or for political theatrical reasons. Regardless, because Donald Trump went on to Twitter and talked a bunch about how it was a Muslim ban, et cetera, the opponents that he faced in court, because it was inevitably brought to court, all they had to do was point at the tweets and say, see, this is being motivated not by legitimate national security reasons, it's being motivated by religious animus. And so because of that, the order ended up getting stayed for a significant period of time. Eventually, the order did go through, because the administration made the legal argument that, no, this is a legitimate order predicated on national security reasons. But if he had not run his mouth in the first place, it probably would have been implemented much faster. And there's been a lot of examples like that throughout the Trump administration, where he could have done something, where he could have gotten a preferred policy passed and implemented if only he had not given opponents of that policy ammunition on Twitter, by which they could use in court to stymie him. So I suspect that this is going to be another example of that, because it seems maybe not clear, but there is evidence that he has provided himself that this order is being animated by animus on his part towards Twitter and other social media companies. Now, that may or may not be a sufficient defense on the part of the defendants to kind of deflect this executive order, but it's certainly going to be an issue at the very least. So for that reason alone, there's reason to suspect this isn't going to go anywhere. But one reason that is one factor that goes against the digital economy here, the social media companies, is some of them have been in court over these kinds of things before and have a somewhat mixed, inconsistent record about what they claim to be. Sometimes they claim to be forums, sometimes they claim to be publishers, depending on the case in question. So that lack of consistency could actually hurt them in court when they're challenging this executive order, because the government is going to argue that they only ever claim to be a forum when it suits them, that they have no real argument as far as whether or not they're a forum. And that being the case, that the government's argument that they're actually publishers should be the one with merit and should be the one that forms the basis of the ultimate judgment. So it's not going to be a slam dunk here for the social media companies. There is a non-zero probability that they could actually lose this and that these changes go forward. It probably won't happen, again, because this, again, is probably mostly political theater on the part of the Trump administration. But this is of concern. This could turn into a problem, and it would have ramifications for the broader internet if it does end up having the kinds of impacts the government is seeking here. So don't worry too much about it, but keep an eye on it. And that's what I would say about this.
Something to watch. This wild frontier. Can we police the president on our platform? Questions at Twitter HQ.
I've got a bunch of other stuff for the US here, but I don't know how much of it is of interest or whether or not we even have time for all of it. How are we doing on?
I saw one question that as soon as I saw it, I was like, I want to know that too.
All right.
Locust versus ducks. What's happening?
So you want an update on the locusts?
Yes.
They're getting worse. The swarms are getting bigger, and now they've spread to northwestern India,
Damn.
or have gone further into northwestern India. I think they've reached the outskirts of New Delhi at this point. You can actually see footage now of people living in suburbs of New Delhi, just taking footage of masses of locusts. Like it looks like I think there was a couple videos I saw where it looked like there was smoke coming up from the city, but it was actually just locust swarms.
Oh man.
So unfortunately, the ducks are probably no longer a viable solution. I think there's just too many of them.
What if we called all the ducks?
What if you called it? If you could do that, then maybe, but I don't think you're going to be able to muster all of the ducks. Yeah, it's a big problem. They're doing a lot of damage to the agriculture in East Africa, and that's a very sensitive. The agricultural sector in Africa is still predominant. So when that happens, when anything happens to the agricultural sector in Africa, it always hits disproportionately hard. And that's what's happening now. India probably will be able to handle it a little bit better. They've got more resources to work with, but even they could be overwhelmed if it gets out of control. I think Pakistan did okay, so that gives me more confidence that India will be, but that still leaves Africa. What they really need to do is that they need to just, spraying is important, obviously, but you kind of have to spray the eggs. If you can get the eggs, then you can significantly curtail the size of the swarms, because it's not as though it's just one big swarm that keeps getting bigger. It's successive iterations that occur. You start with one swarm, and then they breed and then die out, and then new swarm emerges, and then they breed and die out, and etc. So it's not as though it's just one big swarm spreading out. It is successive swarms reproducing and producing successively larger swarms.
All right, hang on. I've got an idea. This is like some StarCraft shit. Are you ready? I have an idea. What if India or whoever is having a problem with this got some ATVs, just like dune buggies or whatever. You mount 2 flamethrowers on the front of that bad boy. And then you have people drive into the locust's base and then use the fire on the eggs.
It's a bit much, but it could work.
It works against me all the time when I play Zerg versus Terran.
Yeah, I think bug spray would be more effective, because the trouble with flamethrowers is that they run out of fuel very quickly. With bug spray, you can you get more for your money. You can spray a much larger area. I think what they've been doing is that they've actually been using crop dusters. They'll stick the bug spray stuff, the chemical that they use. What's the technical name for that? Pesticide. They'll stick pesticide in the crop dusters, and they'll just spray a whole area, as though they were spraying crops. But they'll just wherever the eggs are, wherever the locusts are, they'll spray that. And then apparently that is relatively effective. They don't die right away. The video I saw from East Africa, they were saying that since they sprayed them from the air, they'll die like in a couple of hours, basically, or maybe a day or something like that. But apparently it does work. The trouble in East Africa, if not other places affected by the locust swarms, is that they just don't have enough resources. They have the planes, they just don't have enough of them. And oftentimes they don't have the information they need about where the locusts are breeding. That was one of the original problems in Yemen. They just the locusts were breeding in very remote areas that people didn't really have access to, and so they didn't really know where they were, and you couldn't really get to them. That's also somewhat of a problem in East Africa now. So between lack of information and lack of equipment, it's putting a lot of governments in a hard place. I think I do remember reading online in comments. I really shouldn't be reading comments. It rarely ends well, but I was reading some comments on one of the stories about the locusts, and somebody was asking why so many of these countries that have had problems with locusts before were so unprepared. because locust outbreaks are not necessarily unusual in this region of the world. It is something that they do prepare for. So the issue here is, I mean, obviously there's the significant historical, if not biblical, size of the locust swarms. The fact that they are so large is a relevant factor here. They're just so large that they're overwhelming the resources of even those states that have been well prepared for locust outbreaks. But another problem is that the locust swarms are spreading much further than they would normally, and they're actually starting to spread to states that have not historically had very many run-ins with locusts. And a lot of those states further in the interior of Africa have not had locust problems for a long time, and so their governments do not have agencies or equipment or what have you that are well disposed to handle something like this. And so it was never going to be hard to overwhelm them in the first place. But before, it didn't really matter because they didn't have a lot of problems in the first place. Now that it's a biblical epic, shit show with giant swarms of locusts covering vast regions of the continent, they're in a bad place, and they can't really do much about it. So that's why they're getting overwhelmed. It's a combination of a lack of resources, the size of the swarm, and the fact that the swarm is spreading to places that just haven't had the problems with them traditionally. All of that is combining to produce a very negative result for the region. So it's not really clear where that's going to stop. But that's where we are. That is your locust update.
Well, we got information about something other than Corona. Praise God.
Oh, I got plenty of stuff besides Corona. I've got a whole tab now that I've just dedicated to the non-Corona stuff, and a whole other tab for Corona stuff.
Okay.
To be honest, though, the Corona news has kind of died off. I mean, there's still a lot of stuff happening with it, but like I was kind of talking about before when we were talking about Texas, my suspicion is that more and more people are going to get more and more comfortable with just living with the risk of the virus, and they're probably just going to start resuming normal activity. A lot of people will not, but because significant numbers will, that's probably going to help with the economic recovery. And, ideally, once we have a vaccine or some damn thing over the course of the next 6 months, the other people who are more risk averse will start coming out as well. So for that reason, COVID is kind of falling off the radar a little bit. And obviously there was the Floyd killing in the United States and all of the protests around the world that related to that. That kind of really shifted the focus of the international media a lot. So for that reason also, I've been paying less attention to the to COVID news. So I've got plenty here, non-COVID stuff, if that's what you want.
I'm good with whatever. It's kind of a joke, I think. There's COVID fatigue, and then it's like, well, people are going to be asking about that anyway, so.
Yeah. Well, let me just real quick here, because one of the things I did is I have such a backlog of stuff for, really every region, but for North America in particular. So I just kind of made a short list of the individual topics that I have notes on, and that I'm not necessarily going to get to them, but I'm just going to list them here, just to give you an idea of what's been happening. And if any one of them kind of strikes your fancy, I can dig into it. But I'll just run through the list real quick here, and we'll probably move on to something else or questions or something. So some of the stuff happening in North America relating to foreign policy. The United States government is considering significantly drawing down its military presence in Africa. That has to do with a number of deployments that have been made for a variety of reasons over the past couple decades. A lot of them are focused on counterterrorism, but some of them are peacekeeping and train and support missions, air support, logistics, etc. So the Trump administration has seriously considered drawing down those commitments. The Trump administration is ending, I think has ended, the Open Skies Agreement with Russia. That was an agreement that allowed mutual reconnaissance over each other's airspace. That's over. So that's a problem. This is a fun one. The Trump administration actually placed sanctions on the International Criminal Court. That pretty well speaks for itself. What a time to be alive. The Trump administration also proposed an aid. Well, actually, it wasn't the Trump administration. Actually, I think it was Congress that proposed an aid package to Greenland, which kind of raised some eyebrows in Denmark, because of course the Trump administration was approaching the Danish government about purchasing Greenland not too long ago. So there was some suspicion in Denmark that maybe the U.S. government was up to something with this aid package, maybe some ulterior motives. Uh, Trade war with China is ongoing, and specifically, I never really talked about it, but there was actually a trade deal negotiated between the United States and China. That was phase one. It was meant to be the first phase of a multi-phase trade deal that eventually ended in a complete, all-encompassing trade deal. I didn't really ever talk about the details of that plan. I just talked about the implications and how it was probably mostly theater, so that both governments, Chinese and American, could focus on domestic issues. But technically, the details of that plan are something we could get into. Also, the NAFTA replacement, the USMCA, is set to go into effect. It was negotiated successfully and ratified by all governments involved, but it was not actually set to go into effect until mid-year this year. I don't recall the exact month, but I think it's either happening soon in the next month or has already happened recently. I don't quite remember, but that is going to into effect, so it might be worth kind of reviewing some of the tenets of that deal and some of the negotiations that went into it. So that's all foreign policy stuff I have notes for. That's all happening right now. I doubt that the USMCA implementation is going to mean much, because obviously everybody's economies are kind of in lockdown still, or coming out of lockdown, one or the other. So somewhat depressed economic activity means that you're probably not going to feel the USMCA anytime soon, but that is coming. American politics. So obviously there's this issue with the mail-in ballots coming. That's one particular party, the Republican Party, has kind of been homing in on that. So that's something we're going to be hearing a lot about until the election happens. Something that happened, I think, late last year or early last year that we never got to, there was a Iran War Powers Act that was passed by Congress, and it was actually passed by both the Senate and the House, and ended up getting vetoed by Donald Trump, the president. So I thought that was an interesting case study there, since it was bipartisan bills passing is pretty unusual. So actually, it was early this year, because this was in response to the actions in Iran. When the U.S. had assassinated Mr. Soleimani in Baghdad. So the Congress responded to that in part by passing a War Powers Act, and I think that's what I think I might be getting confused. Well, regardless, it ended up getting vetoed, so I guess it doesn't really matter. But the fact that it passed, the fact that it was bipartisan, I felt was significant, and illustrated the degree of unease in Congress with the Trump administration's handling of certain Middle Eastern affairs. So that could be worth talking about. The administration also threatened to use the Insurrection Act in response to the protests in the United States that broke out after the George Floyd killing. I think people are pretty familiar with that. Have you heard of that, Neuro?
Refresh?
Trump came out and talked to some governors and told them that he wanted to send in the military, basically, deputize the National Guard, and have them go and shut down the protests and riots and whatnot. The Insurrection Act was the legal basis for that, or would have been. He eventually backed off of that, but the fact that he was threatening to use it at all I don't feel like it was a very effective, good choice, politically speaking. That's not to say that the riots didn't need to be dealt with, but throwing around the Insurrection Act I don't feel that was very smart. But that's something we could get into. That was an event that happened that we didn't really get to over the past couple months. When was the last time we did this?
It's been 3 weeks, I think.
Yeah. It has been 3 weeks. Okay, so administration, I had a bunch of these. Some of it is old. The Attorney General, Mr. Barr, was complaining. I think this was late last year. He was complaining that Trump's tweeting was interfering with his ability to do his job. So that was an interesting case study in how the behavior of the president, not Trump specifically per se, but how the behavior of a president can impact the Attorney General and the Department of Justice. And also, it was an interesting case study in the importance of the independence of a judiciary and how institutional norms are constructed to preserve that. Let's see. And then more recently, there were some accusations and allegations about whether or not Mr. Barr, again, the Attorney General of the United States, was politicizing some of his decisions as Attorney General. So some of those came out over the past couple of weeks. I also have a lot of notes on personnel changes in the Trump administration over the past roughly year plus. There's been a number of people who have been removed, who have been related to certain people who have fallen out of favor with the president, who have since been replaced with a number of loyalists of one sort or another. So I kind of read a couple articles that documented that, and I thought it might be worthwhile to kind of go over that to illustrate what it looks like when an administration becomes more loyalist in becomes more loyalist in character, rather, and also the potential implications of those changes. So let's see, that's been happening. We already talked about the executive order on Twitter. The Trump administration also issued another executive order extending the visa ban that had been implemented after the outbreak of COVID in the United States. That's going to have some economic impact because that's a pretty far-reaching blanket ban on a number of visas. That's in particular going to impact the tech industry. So that's something else I have notes on. And there was another executive order very recently on statues. That's political theater. So in so much as political theater is an interesting case study that could be worth talking about. And some miscellaneous stuff. There was a ruling in which the courts ruled that the Trump administration's diverting of funds from the military in order to pay for the construction of the wall on the border was actually not lawful. That was the exact words there. I'm not sure what the difference is between not lawful and illegal. I don't have sufficient legal background to know that, but specifically the ruling was that it was unlawful. As it was, the original court, because this ruling came from an appeals court, the original court did not put a stay on construction of the wall while the court case was ongoing. So the construction actually has already commenced and the funds have already been spent. So there's not necessarily much the government can really do about this ruling. This isn't really going to change much, but technically it does set a precedent. So future administrations, be they the Trump administration or others, will hypothetically not be able to do this, or at least do what Trump tried to do as far as reallocating funds from the military's budget for this purpose. So that's something to talk about. And then we already talked about the different far-right groups that have cropped up. So that's a snapshot of the notes I have for North America here that we haven't been getting to over the past couple months. And any one of them we could get into if desired, but otherwise, I'm just going to kind of move on here. We may get to them later or some other day, but otherwise I'll get into questions.
To the questions.
To the questions. Okay, so I think we do have quite a few here. I'll get through these, but there is other stuff. There's at least one other big story I would want to get to, so I'll try to save that either for last or until we run out of questions. It involves the story in question involves some Mad Max Thunderdome shit happening in the Himalayas. 2020.
Yeah.
So let's see. First question. Have you heard of the increasing tensions between India and China? I spoke too soon. They have moved artillery forces to their shared stretch of border, according to reports. Yes, I have. In fact, that was the story I was just mentioning. I guess I can just do it. I guess we can just jump into that. Let me find the right notes for it. So for those not familiar with this, there's been ongoing border clashes between China and India on their common border along the Himalayan mountain chain. And they're not escalating per se, but they're not stopping either. And the nature of them is interesting. shall we say. Have you heard about these at all, Neuro? Has this come up in chat at all over the past month?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Okay, so this will be new for you. I'm excited. This is a fun one for me. Not that people died, just it's an interesting story. Here we go. Okay. So, border tension between China and India goes back a ways. And it actually goes back even to when the British were in India, when the British Empire controlled India. There was always disagreement about where exactly the border was between British India and China. And that was never really satisfactorily resolved. And after India got its independence, it wasn't really thought to be a big deal. It was just kind of assumed that nobody would really mess with India because it was too big. And so India's military was not underdeveloped per se, but it was not really set up to defend the border very well. And that was a problem in 1962, I think was the year, because in 1962, the Indian government, in its infinite wisdom, decided to challenge the border with China. They sent some border troops into a disputed area in the belief that this was their territory and that they were going to kind of strong arm the Chinese into recognizing it. Stupid move, because again, their military was not in a position to fight, and their border guard was definitely not in a position to fight. And it was exacerbated because the Chinese military at that point had still had quite a few people with quite a bit of combat experience, quite a few people who were veterans of the World War II, the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War. They'd gotten quite a bit of experience by that point. So when the Chinese military was sent in, they were able to discard the Indian border forces with relative alacrity. So suffice to say, India lost that border war. The Chinese could have gone further than they did, but ultimately they sated themselves with trying to send a signal to India not to mess with them, because in fact it was India that kind of instigated that conflict. So after that, things calmed down and things were very quiet for decades. There wasn't another major border flare-up. There were occasional incidents, but nothing major, like a border war. And that lasted right up in the 90s, things started to kind of pick up again. And so they actually negotiated an agreement. I don't think I have the name of the agreement here, but the agreement actually was pretty far-sighted. They agreed not to use either explosives or firearms within something like 100 kilometers of their common border. And obviously the border is disputed, but basically the exact location of the border didn't matter. The idea was in the disputed areas, they were not to use either firearms or explosives. And so even if there were disagreements in future or incidents, there would at least not be a risk of escalating into a shooting conflict, because there would be no guns. And that's actually something that they've held to their common credit. But one of the things that's happened over time, one of the things that's instigated the current confrontation, is that both India and China have been getting wealthier. Both of them have a lot more resources to work with. Before, when they were both fairly poor, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc., they both had a relatively limited capacity to project power into that region, because that is a very isolated area. There's not a lot of infrastructure there at all. So, even getting border forces there is difficult. Keeping them supplied also difficult. So the idea that you're going to send a large force of troops and whatnot up to the border region and, fight a war, it's a little bit outlandish. It was even difficult for the Chinese to get what forces they did during the 62 border conflict out there. And the fact that they were able to make as much gains as they did is more a testament to the lack of preparedness by the Indian military than anything. So as China and India became wealthier, they had more resources to work with in terms of fortifying and developing the border region. And that's really where the problems started, at least in the modern era. Because what they started to do is to start building infrastructure in that area, specifically roads. And the idea was that by developing the infrastructure there and building up the road network, it would be easier to deploy military forces to the border region in the event of a contingency emerging that required them.
and that started a kind of de facto infrastructure race. It wasn't an arms race per se, but it was kind of understood that whoever had the better infrastructure would have a military advantage in the event of a confrontation. And that being the case, infrastructure became a kind of point of competition. And even that wouldn't have necessarily been a problem, except for the fact that some of the infrastructure was built in the disputed areas. And that was kind of a red line. That is generally where one side would feel compelled to respond with some kind of force or show of force. So when you hear about these incidents along the border that have been happening over the past couple of years, but especially this year, a lot of that has to do generally with a road that was built in a disputed area by one side or the other. Generally, that's the genesis of the incident in question. And that has happened in particular over the past couple of years around Sikkim, around Bhutan, to a lesser degree around Nepal. It's kind of its own discussion. But in general, that is the genesis. Is this infrastructure race between them. Now, to give you an idea of some of the incidents in question, just to kind of run through them quickly here. In 2017, there was a standoff between Chinese forces and forces of Bhutan, which is a small Himalayan kingdom that is in between China and India. Now, even though this was a border dispute between Bhutan and China, Indian forces actually got involved, specifically to uphold Bhutan's claim. Because the Indian military's priority as far as China is making sure that China never can or never will get control of a major pass through the Himalayas. Because obviously if you control a pass like that, that's a major strategic advantage. If you control the pass, then you can defend it and prevent them from using it to get across into the Gangetic Plain in northern India. But if you don't control it, then they can just mass forces on the other side of the mountains, and then you kind of have to fight them on an even keel, which the Indian military would prefer to avoid. So they go out of their way diplomatically and strategically to make sure that wherever border disputes arise where the Chinese government might get access to these passes, that there is a strong response from the Indian government. And so that's what happened here. Even though it didn't directly involve India, the Indian government wanted to make sure that the Doklam Plateau, which is the disputed area in question, was not just seized outright by the Chinese. Since obviously the Bhutanese government had a limited capacity to respond. It's a tiny Himalayan kingdom that has very few resources. So the Bhutanese army is obviously going to be no match for the People's Liberation Army. So that was one example. There was also another recent skirmish in which some border guards had a brawl. Again, there's no explosives or firearms, so whenever things get heated, it just turns into a fighting match. Close combat stuff, literally fists often. And let's see, there were some skirmishes in Ladakh, which is in and around Kashmir, at the same time as the fighting around Sikkim. Sikkim is where the brawl happened. Let's see, there was some fighting on the northern bank of the Pekong So Lake, also around Ladakh. To give you an idea of another source of tension, there were some Chinese army units who moved into the disputed Ladakh region after they finished a military exercise. And my suspicion is that was in response to a road that the Indian government had recently built there. So it's a little sleight of hand on the part of the Chinese there to kind of turn some exercises into a show of force like that. And that just kind of illustrates why so many military people get so wary about military exercises. You may read in the news somebody in the military and somebody in a government expressing concern over military exercises happening across their border. And sometimes that gets, sometimes those people are criticized for being over dramatic. They have exercises there all the time. Why worry about it? Well, this is why you worry about it, because you never know if military exercises are going to be leveraged into something else. Because they've already got all their forces massed for the exercise, so it's not exactly too difficult to have them shift gears and maybe invade a territory or breach a border or do something like that. So that's kind of what happened here. And so, of course, that led to a standoff. Now, the most recent one that's been in the news, and the one I'm going to talk about most here, was a brawl that happened in Ladakh in June in what's called the Galwan Valley. And this, ironically, this actually happened during a de-escalation procedure. That 1996 agreement I told you about has procedures in place for de-escalation. When incidents happen, there are specific steps rather, that are to be taken in order to de-escalate confrontations. And it was apparently when that was happening that some kind of brawl broke out. And over 20 Indian troops apparently were killed, probably also a roughly equivalent number of Chinese, but they haven't released their casualties yet, so we don't really know. But the interesting thing about this is the nature of the brawl. Now, in other cases where there have been confrontations like this, generally they've happened because one side or the other is occupying specific territory and won't leave. For example, when the Chinese were building a road through the Doklam Plateau, rather, in the disputed territory, in the territory disputed with Bhutan. In that case, Indian troops were sent in, and they just formed a human chain in order to block progress. They just literally formed a physical barrier to stop the Chinese from constructing the road, and that's where the clashes happened, since the Chinese kind of tried to displace them. So some of that is a kind of nonviolent resistance, almost in a sense. This was not nonviolent resistance. And what happened is that the Chinese and Indians, the Chinese were the ones that were accused of this, and that we have evidence of it, but probably also the Indian side as well. They would use bludgeons and rocks in their brawl, up to and including what were apparently metal rods with nails in them.
Ooh.
I kid you not. So when I talk about Mad Max Thunderdome bullshit, this is what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Because it was not like a minor brawl. It was apparently battle to the death shit. Because, again, several dozen people were killed. A few of them apparently were killed because of exposure. Some people would get injured, and because the climate is so extreme, because, again, it's the Himalayan mountains, it's very high, very thin air, very cold, etc. So some people got injured, and because they were exposed to that climate, ended up dying. And also some people, apparently, they were fighting on a ridge, apparently, so some of them apparently fell into the Galwan River, which was nearby, and of course died of exposure for that reason. So different reasons for the deaths, different attributions, but overall it was just an outright battle to the death brawl over this ridge in question. Eventually it did end and things were able to de-escalate, but it was a pretty nasty incident, pretty bizarre incident. He's probably the most violent thus far.
So you set a rule that's you can't use conventional weapons because we don't want to have a bunch of violence here. And then they're like, well, could we have some like medieval violence? Still kill each other, but only use medieval weapons? Fine. Yeah.
Well, there's nothing in the treaty that says that they can't be violent. It just says if you're going to be violent, you can't use firearms or explosives.
The people who wrote that treaty probably figured they put themselves in range of medieval warfare, like bodily combat. Little did they know.
Little did they know, yeah. Yeah, there's always been clashes and incidents, but I think this is the most that they've escalated. I don't think I've ever heard about this kind of fighting breaking out on the border before. So I've already kind of explained the source of the tension. It's not unusual for there to be incidents over infrastructure and whatnot. And of course, there's the undergirding, factor of economic development. Both sides have more resources to work with, so they're developing the region, and that's leading to more clashes too. But another explanation for the recent spat of clashes, there's been a whole bunch that have happened over the past year or so. Over the past couple months, rather. The suspicion is that this might be a wag the dog for Beijing. Are you familiar with wag the dog, Neuro?
Yeah, basically some hubbub that people can be really focused on and talk about to distract them from something else that's actually a bigger deal at the time.
Exactly. So the suspicion is that the Chinese government is worried about some of the political impact of COVID-19. And that in turn, they're trying to generate some headlines to distract people, kind of get their blood running. Border clashes with rival power, etc. So that's something that they can kind of talk about and focus on, other than all the economic depredations of COVID-19. So this could be what's happening here. It could be the Chinese government is instigating some of this for that reason. But I don't think it's I don't think it's the only reason. There has been road construction by the Indian side as well. So it's not as though they're entirely innocent in this. But yeah, multiple factors involved here. I think those are the major ones. To their credit, they don't seem all that eager for escalation. Whenever incidents have broken out, they've been pretty quick to negotiate de-escalation. So I think that kind of plays into the wag the dog explanation, because that kind of suggests it's more for show than anything. An interesting argument I read in one article is that there's a commitment problem. This is a sort of a game theory term. Both sides expect that their relative power, that is to say, the balance of power between them, is going to change over time because of the rapid pace of economic development in China and India. But because the balance of power is going to change in future, there's not much of a reason to negotiate now over a disputed border. Because in future, you may expect to have more leverage that you could bring to bear to get a better deal. And if you expect that to be the case, then you have no incentive then to really negotiate in the present, or at least less incentive. And it gets even more complicated if you consider if the two actors involved both have expectations that they're going to have more leverage in the future. So when that's the case, then there's not going to be any negotiation. And so for that reason, this author argued there may well be no negotiated settlement to the border dispute anytime soon, even in spite of the clashes, just because nobody really wants to negotiate in the present when they feel that they have an inferior negotiating leverage to what they will have later, once economic growth has improved the resources of the state and their ability to apply pressure. So I thought that was a pretty cool point. A little game theory for you there. Mm-hmm. Also illustrates why there probably won't be a negotiated settlement. Let's see. And yeah, that's about it. I don't think the risk of war is that high. I think it's mostly just for show at this point. And, in general, that has been the pattern. As violent as some of the confrontations have been, it has largely been signaling by the governments in question and not a concerted effort to seize territory, per se. So, posturing, basically. Mm-hmm. High stakes, Mad Max, Thunderdome style posturing.
Very cheap move. It's got some pretty major effects to it, especially if you want to make the news.
So let's see. That kind of that gets to the question here of increasing tensions between India and China. Yeah. So yes, I have heard of the tensions, but I wouldn't. The original question noted that they've moved artillery forces to their shared stretch of border, according to reports. Yeah, that's true, but that's more of a contingency. There's not really much threat that they'll actually use artillery, because again, they have the 1996 agreement barring use of explosives. And both sides have honored that, and both sides have signaled to each other implicitly that they don't want escalation. So I suspect that's just the movement of the artillery forces is probably just contingency more than anything else. So let's see, that's one question down. Next question. And if I ever don't answer somebody's question to their satisfaction, I would encourage them to ask again, because I've misread questions before and missed their point, except excuse me. I've misread questions before, so if I get something wrong, please do ask me again, and I'll be happy to return to it. So let's see, this next one. Considering current stuff happening, especially in the US, what is your feeling on the next election cycle? Do you think we could see another Trump presidency with Electoral College interaction like in 2016 or without? Yeah, it's hard to predict what's going to happen in the 2020 election, rather, because it's still pretty far away. Keep in mind, it was not that long ago, just a few months, that people were saying that Trump had a pretty good chance of getting reelected because the economy was doing so well. Obviously, things have changed pretty considerably since then. So that being the case, and also it's 2020, so we seem to get a new crisis every other month, and so keep in mind we're still several months out from the election, and it's in November. So we've still got lots of time to go. And as we've seen thus far this year, there's a lot that can happen in a month. So predictions are, I don't think you can really predict what's going to happen at this point. It's really wide open, I think.
All bets are off, as some would say.
So it is possible. I would not rule it out, but I can't say that Biden is definitely going to win either. I just don't. I can't really make a prediction. It's really just going to be a function of what happens between now and November. I think more than anything. Let's see. Can you clarify what the Electoral College is, and do you feel it will survive into the future as part of the election process? I'll try. I've tried this before, and it did not go entirely well, but I'll take a crack at it. So the Electoral College is the political institution in the United States by which the President of the United States is selected. In the United States, we have broken up the decision-making power about how to vote for president amongst the different states. So rather than have one nation, one United States, all voting for president and having all the votes counted up and attributed to corresponding candidates and the winner decided accordingly, instead we allow states to determine how their votes are allocated. And not only that, we do not allow them to allocate the specific number of votes that go to each candidate. We allow them to allocate what is called electoral votes. So each state gets a certain number of electoral votes based on its population, based on the size of its population. So bigger population means more electoral votes. And each state decides how it wants to assign its electoral votes individually. So different states actually have different ways of doing this. Most of them have rules in place that require electoral votes to be assigned according to whoever got the most votes in the state. So if most people in a given state vote for the Republican presidential candidate, generally that state will have a rule that will require all of the state's electoral votes to go to the Republican presidential candidate. So in the end, whoever has the most electoral votes will win, rather than the most direct votes. Some states have a proportional system set up where the electoral votes are divided amongst the different presidential candidates in a way that reflects the division of votes in the state. But there's not very many states that do that. I think maybe Vermont. Small states, basically. There's no major states, and I don't think there's any swing states that do that. I think Iowa and Vermont are the only ones that do that. There has been some push to kind of do proportional voting for everybody, for every state, but the federal government can't really make them do that. It could try it, but I mean, even if you passed a constitutional amendment, the states would. Well, I guess if you passed a constitutional amendment, it would be fine, but states would probably fight it beforehand because they wouldn't like the imposition of they would not like the dilution of their authority in the matter. But roughly speaking, that's what the Electoral College is. It's just a means by which states allocate their votes in order to decide who the president is. And that's a reflection of the importance of states in the federal system. We have a very decentralized government in the United States, relatively speaking. And one of the manifestations of that is that states have lots more responsibility than they would in a more centralized system. And one of the responsibilities is, one of the responsibilities and rights, I guess I should say, is that they get to decide how they vote for president. There actually was briefly proposed some proportional voting systems back in the 60s, I think. But they were knocked down because they were seen as, they were perceived as being proposed in order to fight the civil rights movement. The idea was that if there was proportional voting in southern states, then they would just use it to ensure that black people never had a majority. Since white people were the majority, and so proportional voting would mean that they would be the clear majority and could dismantle civil rights legislation or undermine federal efforts at integration or what have you, basically. So that was a concern at that time and could possibly be a concern now. It would just depend on how you did it, basically. And if you're asking me about the history of the Electoral College, that's something I'm not as well prepared for. That's. I originally had the impression, apparently, which was wrong, that the Electoral College was designed the way it was in order to account for the fact that it was so difficult, just geographically, for a country as large as the United States in the late 1700s to organize a national vote. And so, for that reason, delegated responsibility for managing the vote to the states, and hence the electoral system. That way, every state could just be responsible for handling its own election, and then they could pass on the results to the federal government, and then the federal government could just deal with the result as necessary, as opposed to having the federal government handle everything, or some kind of federal-state cooperation, which would have been relatively difficult given the lack of resources at the time. That may still be part of the reason for the Electoral College to exist, but I've been reading other articles that suggest there were other factors at play, so I think I need to study it more to really get into the history of it. I think one of the articles I read was an explicitly anti-racist article, or written by a member of the anti-racist movement, and they were illustrating the role of slavery as an institution and how it influenced the negotiation of the Electoral College. The argument of the author in question was that Southern states wanted to have the votes of black people count without actually giving them the right to vote, because obviously the vast majority of black people in the South at the time were slaves. But Southern white politicians wanted to somehow translate the presence of those slaves into political power, to have them count in votes for president. Now, obviously, people in the North did not want to do that, but the Southerners had sufficient political power to negotiate a settlement that involved some recognition of that, to incorporate the slaves into the calculation of their electoral votes. Because again, the electoral votes are assigned to each state according to population. So that system, the system of the Electoral College, which is based on population, is favorable to Southern slaveholding states, or was at the time, because they could count slaves de facto in the vote in a way that they would not be able to do if it was just a one man, one vote for president. Because again, if the slaves don't vote, then their votes aren't present. They won't count. So in that sense, the Electoral College could be argued to be a legacy institution of the need of the founding fathers to try to negotiate a settlement that was satisfactory to slaveholding states, and in that sense is tainted by association. I imagine there's some truth in that, but I would want to read more, because the anti-racism movement, for all of the good it does, also has a bad habit of reductivism, wherein they try to reduce everything in American history to slavery one way or the other, whether it's warranted or not. That's a kind of deductive reasoning that can be poisonous. So I'm not saying they're wrong, but I'm saying I would want to look at some other sources before I take that to heart. But that just illustrates that the electoral institution does have a complicated history, and that there's a lot of factors that went into its construction. And so I can't get too into that detail, but hopefully I've sufficiently outlined how it works to kind of give listeners an understanding of what it's doing and what's at play and what it was intended to do.
Yeah, we've talked before about the quote, the tyranny of the masses, and I think that was initially supposed to be one of the main reasons for it, was the average person at that time, and still kind of in present day in the US, is not super educated, especially when it comes to a lot of these really crucial votes. So from their perspective in the government, do we want people who know nothing about this to have a heavy sway in being able to decide the outcome? It insulates them against that, like in case there is someone who is particularly charismatic but doesn't really understand too much about how the government works. Somehow Trump still got into office. But yeah, it's supposed to have some purpose. Is the purpose being fulfilled by it? I mean, we're very dissatisfied with our Congress, legislature. Many people are dissatisfied with the president. I think dissatisfaction is at an all-time high, so something is fucked up. The question is, what do we need to fix?
Well, I have two responses to that. One, I would refer back to the discussion, the statements I made earlier about how voters are kind of at the core of the problem. It's we were talking before about police reform and the protests and whatnot, and I was arguing that you can implement changes, but fundamentally the reason that we have the problem in the first place is because voters have disparate political preferences and don't know how to reconcile their differences. You can extrapolate that same argument to this, to the Electoral College and among other problems. There's a lot of ill feeling on the part of disparate political factions in the United States, and until they learn how to handle that better, you're probably not going to make a lot of headway in really resolving any of these issues. So that's one response to that. But the other response is that the Electoral College has more problems than just that. I mean, it's also that one of the criticisms is that states, electoral votes, so to speak, from different states have different values. So if you're in a populated state, that is to say, a state with relatively more population than others, those electoral votes reflect more people. The electoral vote per population is watered down, so to speak, such that the electoral votes from less populous states actually have more power. And that's a criticism that reflects the innate bias in the institution towards less populated states. And if you live, if you live in a less populated state, that's not too big a deal. They don't mind. But there is an argument from the more populated states that it's a kind of disenfranchisement because it disempowers them and weakens their political influence. And we kind of saw the outcome of that with the 2016 election, where Trump actually lost the popular vote but still won because he had more electoral votes. A lot of those votes that would have won a popular election probably were urban votes, probably were votes in the more populated parts of the country. So that being the case, then, it's especially the urban areas and the developed, built-up areas that are upset with the Electoral College at this point. But again, that goes back to the voter issue. That's, if you want to change the Electoral College, you're going to have to amend the Constitution. I believe that to be the case. Please correct me if I'm wrong in chat, but I believe you would have to amend the Constitution to change that. And amending the Constitution is not like passing a law. Like, amending the Constitution is a big deal because that is the core, that is, the granite core of the political system in the United States. So any effort to change it is just inherently going to be politically sensitive and will require a great deal of political finesse, grace, and humility. And we don't really have those things right now. So so I'm more than a little skeptical that it would really even be feasible politically at this point to really change it. But even if you did change it, you would have to change it in a way that appealed, that satisfied everybody's concerns and interests. And even that would be difficult even without all of the partisanship. So it's a tall order at this point. So I don't think it's going away for that reason. I think it is going to last a long time. I just don't see any consensus on an alternative emerging anytime soon. And I would point out here, one of the larger structural trends in the United States is the ongoing urbanization of the United States. Not only people moving from rural areas to urban areas, but people from both urban and rural areas moving to super urban areas, a kind of metropolitanization of the country. It's more, the biggest cities in the United States, the metropolitan areas keep getting bigger, and they're comprising more and more of a proportion of the population. So there are corresponding cultural changes and political changes to that, and none of them are favorable to people who live in rural areas, who often have very different economic interests and political preferences. And as that process rolls out, we're eventually going to get a point to where the urban areas, and especially the metropolitan areas, are going to be the dominant political decision makers in the United States. And there's not going to be much the rural areas can do about it. But right now, we're in between those two phases. We're in a transition phase where before, the rural areas had significant political power, not quite dominant, but significant. And we're transitioning away from that to a point where they're going to have significantly reduced power. And that transition was always going to be ugly, just because of the significant gulf, the significant differences that exists between urban rural folks in the United States. So that was always going to be hard. And this, I think, is one of the drivers here with discontent with the Electoral College, because obviously that is a tool that the rural areas can use as a way to disproportionately advantage themselves in a de facto political competition with urban America, as it were. So I think the Electoral College will last as long as it takes to either achieve some kind of reconciliation between disparate political factions in the United States, or for urban America to reach sufficient critical mass to impose its preferences on rural America. One or the other, I think. Okay, so the next question, do you think that stagflation is on the way? How do you think the pendulum will swing in terms of inflation in general? Do you think we have taken sufficient measures to keep the current inflation rate stable? So let's see. Do I think stagflation is on the way? No. Inflation has been missing from the economy for a long time. We've kind of talked about that before. So I don't know that there's really enough evidence to make me think otherwise, that, this time will be different. This time we're going to spend all this money at the federal level and at the monetary level, and now we're going to have inflation where we haven't before, despite, even though we've done this before. We did the quantitative easing after the 2008 financial crisis. And we did, the Obama administration stimulus programs, and the effect on inflation of those things was pretty mild. And that's a phenomena that we see in other parts of the world, especially developed countries like Japan and Europe. They also have missing inflation, as it were. So I don't know that this is going to be any different. I could be wrong. We don't really know how the modern economy works because we don't have enough data, which is another issue we've talked about before. And that being the case, I really can't predict with confidence what will happen. But if only to go by what little precedent we have, it seems like there won't be significant inflation. So in that sense, for that reason, I don't think there will be stagflation. How do you think the pendulum will swing in terms of inflation in general? I think it's going to continue to stagnate. I don't have enough data to really say that with confidence, like I was saying before. But if I had to guess, that's what I would say. I'd say that I don't think we've reached a point of post-scarcity, but I think we have reached a point where certain goods and services that had been considered the core drivers of inflation no longer are. So a lot of the items that are used to construct the consumer price index in the United States, which is the tool that we use to estimate inflation, a lot of those goods and services are made so efficiently now, or have sufficiently efficient supply chains, that they are very resilient to supply shocks of one sort or another, or demand shocks, just externalities in general. Rather than competing on price, a lot of them will compete on other things. That is to say, firms that produce these goods, they will try their hardest not to change the price in response to shocks as much as possible, because that's just how they compete. It's something you learn in business school. Don't compete on price if you can get away with it. So I think there's enough efficiency in the system and enough slack in the industrial capacity that maybe we're at a point now where a lot of core goods and services are made in a way that allows their prices to be sticky to a point where they are very resilient to external shocks to a degree that they never have been before, and to a degree that means that inflation is being driven by other factors now in other areas of the economy. Now, that's purely speculation on my part, and I'm not super up on the literature. I've fallen way behind on academic stuff over the past few years, unfortunately. But if I had to make a prediction, it would be that things will continue to stagnate. Prices will continue to stagnate, if only for that reason. That's not to say that there won't be something else that could drive them up, but I think for now, we're okay. Unless modern monetary theorists get in power, and then we're all screwed. That changes the game considerably. Printing money, I'm not really convinced by the MMT theory that printing money can be workable. I'm not convinced by that argumentation, to put it mildly. Let's see. And then the third part of the question, do you think that we have taken sufficient measures to keep the current inflation rate stable? Yeah, I mean, I think the emphasis right now is on countering deflationary pressure. So there's not really a lot of inflationary pressure that needs to be worried about. But the Fed has it well within its wheelhouse to deal with inflation if it were to finally arise. It's not like, I think people are often mistaken about what the Federal Reserve has been doing in response to the crisis, because I think people see headlines about the Federal Reserve, quote unquote, spending trillions of dollars, bailing out corporations, end quote. And that's not quite accurate. It's not that the Federal Reserve is just printing money, as it were, although it actually has been doing that to a degree. But the money that it introduces into the economy, that it injects in the economy in order to boost the money supply, it is injected into the economy by way of buying assets. And those assets can, at a later date, be sold in order to soak up excess money supply. So the Federal Reserve has this tool in its toolbox with which it can use after it injects money into the economy, like it has been doing, to significantly reduce the money supply as it sees fit to the degree necessary. So even though the Fed hasn't really been doing anything to counter inflation, because again, it's not focused on countering inflation, it's focusing on countering deflationary pressure. But if the steps it has taken thus far were to lead to significant inflation, I think the Federal Reserve is well disposed in terms of its toolbox of potential actions that it could take in response. It is well disposed in that regard to respond to inflation. So I wouldn't worry about it too much in that sense. Again, I'm not saying that there's nothing to worry about and there definitely won't be significant inflation. I'm just saying that as far as Federal Reserve actions vis-a-vis inflation, I think it's doing its job. It's doing what we would expect it to do. Let's see. The next question was, given that ICU bed capacity was primary reason for the lockdown and we've seen less than 30% usage in states like California, what is the reasoning for the continued lockdown? Is there a changed narrative that is for the benefit of the large corporations that profit from an increased lockdown duration, e.g. tech companies? I don't think that's the case. I think it's just, I hate to say it, but I think it is just politics. In the case of, the Republican Party in general is kind of emerging as the party of risk tolerance. They're willing to get the economy rolling again, even if it means exposing people to the virus. And not a few people of those people in question who are being put in a position where they're going to be more exposed to it are averse to that. But the Democratic Party, in turn, is more the party of risk aversion. They're the ones who kind of want to lock down the economy and try to protect people more and mitigate the risk of the virus spreading to more people. So in California, the government is heavily Democratic. It has been for a while now. Excuse me. So that being the case, it's really no shock that they're maintaining quarantine measures. So even if it's not spreading as much, even if the numbers go down as far as new infections and cases and whatnot, I would totally expect California to maintain relatively strong quarantine measures indefinitely, until there is a relatively high degree of confidence that the virus's proliferation is under some degree of control. So that being the case, no shock here. I think that is just the reason for the continued lockdown. It is just political preferences on the part of the California government and the California voters. So I don't think it's like a conspiracy by, special interests to try to push the government in California to continue the lockdown normal than it should, so to speak, for the benefit of somebody's bottom line. I think it is just political preferences on their part. What kind of changes, this is the next question, what kind of changes to the police oversight structure can the protests realistically achieve? How is oversight regulated in general? It's kind of two different questions there. How is oversight regulated in general? It's done differently in different localities. So for those who aren't familiar with this, and this is touches on what I said earlier, the U.S. is a decentralized political system. It's a federal political system. So there is no unified command structure for the police. In places like France, I think, and probably most other countries, the police are a part of a national police force that is controlled by the national government. And there are varying degrees of, discretionary power delegated to localities and regions and whatnot. But, officially they are controlled by the national government. That is not how it works in the United States. In the United States, police departments all over the country are almost all controlled by either localities or by state governments. The federal government has the FBI and probably a few other agencies I'm not familiar with, but for the most part, the federal government does not have any substantive control over police departments in the United States. It can influence them, it can offer them money, and then after it offers them that money, they can threaten to take the money away if they don't do this, that, or the other. But localities always have at their discretion the right of declining federal money. So if the feds say that we'll give you money, but only if you do things our way, police departments are totally within their right to say no, and many of them do. And that speaks to the problem because police departments, because they're not unified, or there's no one group or institution you can go to try to reform all of them. You have to reform each of them at a local level. And there's something like 18,000 police departments in the United States. So it's not like a small number of police departments that we're talking about here. It's not necessarily a bad thing either, because local politics is the level of politics that people have the most influence over. And so if you can make it a local issue, then you can actually empower people more than you could if you tried to make it a federal issue. Because if it, once it becomes national, then it becomes locked in that sort of partisan gridlock at the national level. But if you can make it local, it's relatively more likely you'll be able to get consensus and get the kind of reforms that you want. So that being the case, it's difficult to answer the question of what oversight mechanisms are in place because there are so many different oversight mechanisms implemented by so many different police departments. I mean, in some cases, it's going to be almost none. In some places, they just don't really, in some cases, they just don't have the resources to have a strong oversight mechanism, a big human resources department or any of that. Like if you're talking about like a county sheriff, for example, the police force for the whole county may be just like half a dozen dudes. So in that case, the oversight mechanism is probably more elections. Because in a lot of places in the United States, sheriffs and other heads of police departments are actually elected. Those positions are elected positions, and in that sense, the accountability comes in the ballot box. And, if people don't like what you're doing, they can just vote you out. But of course, that only happens every so often. So there's the issue of having to deal with issues before the election happens. You can have a recount a recall rather, or something like that. But that gets into the weeds a bit. So, suffice to say that there are some localities and areas that probably do not have very much in the way of oversight, just because there's not much to oversee. Small departments and whatnot, and everybody knows each other in small communities anyway. So it's not like if somebody does something wrong, it's not like it's somebody you've never seen before and don't know. It's probably your cousin or something, and you probably know him well enough to know why he did it and whether or not he should be punished for it or not. So that's a lot trickier if you're dealing with people who don't know each other and make assumptions about each other based on their political preferences. That adds a whole layer of complexity there. But for larger polities, larger localities, generally they, at the very least, have a human resources department that is responsible for enforcing codes of behavior in the department, if not also city ordinances and regulations relevant to police behavior. So the HR department is your first layer of accountability. As has been seen, over the past year, that mechanism is of limited utility in the grand scheme of things, and that has to do with certain rights and privileges that are assigned to police departments as a result of negotiations between cities and localities and police unions, which often push very hard for not necessarily unaccountability per se, but for accountability procedures and mechanisms that are more likely to give them the benefit of the doubt, that are skewed or otherwise biased relatively more in their favor than they could be. So what happens in places where the status quo kind of breaks down and public trust collapses? Generally what happens is some kind of civilian oversight board is created. And the board is generally manned by city officials and local leaders, community leaders, leaders of NGOs, or leaders of religious communities, etc. They just get people who are broadly representative of the community generally and have them come up and serve on the board. And the board in turn is responsible for reviewing controversial police actions in order to ascertain whether or not the use of force in question was appropriate and whether or not further punishment is warranted. And sometimes these commissions have informal power. They may not have binding power. In other words, their resolutions and decisions may not be binding. But in some cases they are. Again, it just varies from place to place. And the scope of their power also, kind of waxes and wanes depending. But having a committee like that is another form of accountability that you often see kind of come up after these kinds of after significant events, like say the killing of George Floyd. Atlanta is kind of well known for having a relatively solid police force. They had anyway a relatively good reputation with the locals. And one of the reasons for that is because, after some incidents back in the 1990s, there was a big negotiation in the city about what to do with it, and they came up with a civilian oversight board that was responsible for trying to make sure that the police were adhering to their own rules and that the public sentiments about what constituted inappropriate use of force was incorporated into the decision-making accountability process. So Atlanta was known for that, but as we've seen, even that is relatively limited. To a degree, a certain amount of abuse by the police is kind of built in to the institution, either because of the lack of training. There's different factors that go into it, and that's something else we can kind of get to. So either binding or non-binding civilian oversight boards, human resources departments within the police department itself, political accountability. Technically, the police departments are controlled by civilians. They are controlled by the civilian government, which is elected in most places. And to that degree, there is accountability because the public's elected officials can crack down on the police department if they want to. Generally, that leads to a confrontation with the union, which is why it doesn't happen very much. But that is another layer of accountability right there. So I think those are the ones that I'm thinking of off the top of my head, and I don't know that I can think of very many more, if any more, because this isn't really my topic. I should point that out. I'm not super well read in the field of criminology, and if that is indeed the appropriate field, maybe something to do with unions would be more appropriate. But I just want to point that out, just to illustrate that this isn't like, don't walk away from listening to me thinking that, this is the gospel truth.
Agent Smith told me all about it. Now I'm going to tell you.
Yeah. This is more of a broad outline that I'm trying to do than anything too concrete. But that's a rough review of oversight mechanisms in the United States. I guess I should point out there's also the courts. You can technically sue police if they do something, but I think it's been pretty well established at this point that is of very limited utility. That has to do with qualified immunity, which is that's a sort of rule in the United States that I think it's something that the courts decided on. The courts kind of came up with it. It was the idea that police have a relatively high threshold at which they get the benefit of the doubt. Given that the police find themselves frequently in dangerous situations, it was the court's opinion that it would be better to give the police very broad discretion in how they use authority, and more to the point, very broad discretion in how the use of that discretionary authority on the part of the police is used. So rather than saying strictly, this person complained against you, this person was hurt, etc., so now we're going to punish you, the police are frequently given the benefit of the doubt in the sense that the actions that resulted in the negative outcome were legitimate or were rational or were excusable. So that's roughly what qualified immunity is. It is basically a kind of security, well, not security blanket, but it is a kind of guard for the police against frivolous lawsuits that might come from people who may have gotten hurt in the course of an interaction with the police, or maybe even somebody who wasn't hurt but just felt, put upon. The idea there being that these people can just frivolously bring lawsuits against the police department or individual police, to the point where the police in question may become averse to doing their job. They may see a given interaction or an opportunity to enforce the law, but then forego it out of fear that maybe it could result in an altercation that leads to a lawsuit that they are liable for. So that is the logic behind qualified immunity. There's some obvious criticisms there. The easier it is for police to engage in bad behavior without being punished, then the more bad behavior you're going to have. And qualified immunity, it has been alleged, enables bad behavior among police because it does give them such a broad ambit to use their authority without fear of consequence that it's almost inevitable that you're going to have abuses. So that is sort of the counter-argument there as far as qualified immunity. And that's why the courts don't really work. It's long story short. That's why it's so difficult to sue police and whatnot. So the first part of the question, I kind of answered the second part first. The first part of the question was, what kinds of changes to police oversight structure can the protests realistically achieve? Well, I'll point out again that kind of comes down to their ability to negotiate something with voters of opposing viewpoints, since there's a lot of voters who support having strong-arm police and the status quo. And if you don't convince them, then you're not going to be able to accomplish anything, since they're not going to vote for it. That's the first barrier. If you can get past that barrier, then you've got the problem of actual policy implementation. And I kind of did write up a little list of some of the factors that are involved in police violence. So some of these are things that you can do. Let me see if I can find the right ones here. So some of the things you can do include changing the standard operating procedure. This doesn't really change accountability or oversight per se. But one form of exercising power over the police on the part of the city or by voters is by trying to compel them to change their standard operating procedure. Because a lot of what bugs people about police in the United States are actions by the police that kind of make them feel small, that belittle them, that make them feel humiliated, etc. But a lot of those things have to do with standard operating procedure that is inherently biased towards the safety of the officer. There's a lot of cautionary actions, tactics, strategies, etc., that are outlined in standard operating procedures across the country in almost every police department that are specifically designed to minimize risk to the officer during a given encounter. So, for example, if you get pulled over and the police officer yells at you to get out of your car and you have to lie down on the ground, etc., and he pulls his gun on you, in certain circumstances, it could be argued that's warranted and is necessary in order to ensure that if the officer is afraid that the suspect is armed and dangerous, to ensure that that officer does not have to observe normal procedure, which would, in that situation and circumstance, put them at risk. So, in general, there's a kind of spectrum of how to do that, of how to handle dangerous situations like that where the officer thinks there is risk. And you can put the risk more on the suspect, in other words, on the citizenry, or you can put the risk more on the officer with the expectation that the officer just kind of accept that there's a risk to the job and take that. And right now, on that spectrum, we're definitely on the side of the officer and protecting the officer. And I think one thing that has to happen is that just has to change. I don't think that's a good thing or a bad thing. I just think that's the inevitable equilibrium. Just given that so much of what police departments around the country do as far as dealing, just the inherent way that they deal with the police, and as a result, in so much as that's a result of the standard operating procedure, I think there's just going to have to be a change to the standard operating procedure such that the police end up taking on more risk in exchange minimizing the number of negative encounters that create these kinds of problems, this kind of tension that undermines the public trust in police institutions. I don't know that there's really any other way around it. So I think that's definitely something that's going to happen and pretty much has to happen in order for things to reach some kind of new equilibrium where everybody is at least satisfied with the status quo, if not necessarily happy about it. So standard operating procedure is important in that vein. And I kind of wish people would focus more on that, since that would have some very tangible effects relatively quickly. The reason it hasn't happened before, for those curious, is because police unions fight that shit tooth and nail. The police unions want as much protection for the officers as possible. So they take that very seriously and fight very hard for that. I think we have enough political support in at least some localities, if not a lot of them, to kind of overcome that. But it's going to take a lot of political support for any civilian government who takes on a police union. So it's going to vary. Results will vary considerably depending on the distribution of power within a given city and how powerful the union is. So that's SOP. Other forms of accountability that you could do. I mean, watering down qualified immunity would be a big one. That alone would help. I'm sure, again, there would be some negative consequences from that. I'm not saying there wouldn't be, but in terms purely of accountability, watering down or otherwise removing qualified immunity would definitely significantly improve qualified immunity. Improve accountability. Another argument I've heard is having the police themselves. This is actually something from the sovereign citizen community. And if you know anything about them, you know how wackadoodle they can be. But one idea that they've proposed is to have every police officer take out a bond. That is to say, basically, borrow money. And they will be obligated to pay that money back. And I don't know if they get to keep the money they borrow or not. I'm not sure how that works. But the idea is that they take out a bond. And if they do anything wrong, if they engage in some behavior that puts the police department on the hook for damages in a case, then that officer in question, the money from that, I guess that's how it works. The money from the bond will be used to pay that, and then the officer will be on the hook to pay for the bond himself. Otherwise, if he never gets in trouble, then the money will just be held in escrow, and then the department will be able to just give that money back to the officer once he's retired. But otherwise, or fired, as it were. But otherwise, if there's some incident that happens that he caused, then the bond money would be used for that, and then he would be on the hook for paying back whoever he borrowed the bond money from. So that's one idea. I don't think that's going to be popular with police unions at all. I don't know that I necessarily blame them. There's a lot of uncertainty and risk with that particular system. But those are just some different ideas about how accountability could change, how institutions of accountability could be implemented.
And I think this is related to a conversation I had with my parents that was off the back of watching the Bruce Lee documentary. In the process of building bridges, if you're trying to get people to agree on something, with the point earlier we discussed about people feeling like any stating of one of the political opinions is a personal attack on everyone of that opinion. Mm-hmm. That's incorrect. If we have a systemic problem, we need a systemic solution that addresses the systems in place.
Yeah.
Kind of goes back to the bad apples versus bad barrels versus bad barrel makers. And the apples in this instance would be officers of the law. Barrels would be the police departments and the situations that police officers and people find themselves in. And then barrel makers would be the institutions in place and the laws in place that shape how police work is done in the departments.
Yeah.
And these protests are basically trying to address all of them in some capacity, but really the humans involved in the process are, I think, we're more similar than we are different in a lot of capacities. So it's about changing the barrel making process of how we are deciding how police work is done in the US.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what it comes down to. People do have a right to determine how their community is policed. And there are mechanisms in place to facilitate that kind of debate, and that's kind of where we are. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's always going to be disagreements about what police should do and what policing should look like, and there always has been, and there always will be. The important thing is that the mechanisms of representative democracy, operate and reflect the will of the public. And again, it's going to be difficult in the present because people are so just divided, as it were. Just so many people just can't handle that. But we are, there is nothing wrong in principle. There is nothing inherently hostile with a community saying, I don't like the way we're doing this and I want to do it differently, because it is their institution. They are public servants. And the public has a right to determine how those public servants do their job. So I wish people, as you say, I wish people would not quite take it so personally. I know that a lot of critics of the police have been using very personal terms, so I can't begrudge people being upset at that. But I think it's important to keep eyes on the prize, as it were. Keep your focus on the big picture. The big picture is that there are people who want some change to the way policing is done, and so those are the people you need to engage with and negotiate with, so that everybody can reach an acceptable outcome and compromise.
Yeah, for a foundational approach to it, one of the quotes that's a favorite of mine is, "The king lives to serve his people. Without his people, there is no king." The police exist to serve the public. If there is no public, there is no police. So one needs the other to exist, basically. So it should be thinking about, how can the police serve the public in a way that the public feel safe and protected? One of the things that I was told growing up, if you get pulled over by a police officer, you try to be as polite, yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am, as you would to any other person who deserved respect, which is everybody. And then at the end of the conversation, even if they give you a speeding ticket, you say, "Thank you for serving and protecting us." And I hadn't really thought about that quote very much, but I think with this discussion about racism within the police and how police work is done, the police have not been serving and protecting everyone equally. So that's also what we're trying to fight for here, is that this service and protection is universal, that every citizen deserves to be treated fairly, equally, and not suspiciously unless there's evidence in play. And that's a really big ask, given that we have a lot of bias and prejudice that's hardwired into us with tribalism, and we have a lot of traditions that work against us, where we have grandparents who said a bunch of racist stuff in the home and you're told to respect your grandparents. So it's a big issue, and basically every human person plays a part in it. So good luck, America.
Good luck with that. Yeah. We're running short on time. In fact, I think we're out of time. So I don't know, how do you want to play this?
I mean, that was a good wrapping it up note. Unless you had another little topic you wanted to touch on.
So many.
I've got 65.
Well, I didn't even, these were all old questions. I didn't even get to the ones we got today. So I kind of feel guilty for not getting to the new ones. I'll try to make a more concerted effort next time to get through all the questions, because I think it's not good to have people ask questions and not have them answered in the same session, as it were, because I suspect that a lot of people who ask them don't stick around, or at least are not available when they're actually answered the next time.
Yeah, well,
So
we do have
try to do that.
a ton of people here as well, and I would guess this information is new to a lot of people, so you rock. Thanks for coming on, dude.
No, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for handling questions. Thank you, chat, for providing questions and being pleasant and cool. Next week, I think this will be I'll still be available next week. It's the week after that, I think, that I might miss. So we'll say tentative for next week. I'm going to be going on vacation with family. And then after that, we should be pretty much back to normal. But yeah, there's plenty of stuff to talk about. We may do, if you don't like answering old questions and leaving the new ones, you might hit the recent questions first and then do the old questions after.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. That's the intuitive solution. I should have thought of that. Yeah, you're right. And I'll try to do that in future.
And we have your regular poke of, as soon as your Patreon is ready, I can push it for you and help you out with that.
Yeah, I need to work on that. Stuff has been happening over here, and it's trouble focusing. So we may talk about that someday. But yeah, I'll definitely let you know. Well, definitely. And thank you for the offer. I also appreciate that.
No problem, dude. We're a team. Well, cool. This concludes another amazing episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith. Catch you on the next one.